I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 651 Poland's Good Brother. At present, several major streets in Paris have been fully asphalt, making them smooth and comfortable, and full of a sense of the future that transcends this era. The carriage stopped at the new Paris business district between Paris and the Palace of Versailles. Prince Poniatowski sighed. I really hope Warsaw can be so prosperous one day. He walked out of the carriage and saw the newly built sports ground in front of him. The shape was obviously modeled after the Roman Colosseum. The surrounding buildings seem a bit sparse, and there are not many pedestrians. There are only 2 wooden tracks that lead to the sports field. Slightly lonely. But considering that this place was still a forest and wasteland 3 years ago, the overall construction speed is already quite fast. Prince Poniatowski first followed the French officials who greeted him into the athletes' hotel to express condolences to the Polish athletes participating in the games. The food, accommodation and round-trip travel expenses for these athletes are provided by the French government, as long as you can meet the registration results, you can get this expense. So a full 18 athletes from Poland came to Paris. The entire athlete-only hotel was full of people. The French official on the side smiled and told the prince that there were more than 200 athletes from all over the world coming to participate in the games this time. The first Olympic Games more than 100 years later only had more than 250 athletes. In the 18th century, when transportation capabilities were still very backward, this was definitely an unprecedented event. However, Prince Poniatowski's thoughts were not on the games at all. He briefly encouraged the Polish athletes and rushed to the Palace of Versailles without stopping. He knew that his visit to France this time was likely to determine Poland's future destiny. In the Royal Ordnance Factory on the southeast side of the Palace of Versailles, Prince Poniatowski met the French Crown Prince as scheduled. The reason why Joseph chose to meet here was that there were relatively few idle people and would not attract attention. Second, the place is open and things like maps and sand tables are ready made. It is a pleasure to meet you again, Your Royal Highness the Crown Prince. The prince stroked his chest and saluted. His Majesty the King asked me to convey my gratitude for the large amount of selfless help you have given to Poland. Joseph smiled in return, and then dragged him to sit down. We are relatives. You don't need to be polite. Louis XV married a Polish princess, so France and Poland were indeed related by marriage. Time is precious. Let's get down to business. Joseph skipped the pleasantries and changed his expression to a serious one. First of all, you must transfer the Prussian officers in the army. The prince nodded. Yes, Your Highness. You mentioned this to me a few years ago, but they did not. Joseph really wanted to give the stubborn big man in front of him to loud bangs. He thought to himself, do I understand history, or do you? But he could only suppress his emotions, and gave a reason that the Poles could not refuse. As you know, the relationship between our country and Prussia is not very good. Well, in the past few years, we have been in the southern Netherlands and Silesia. There was a war. When Poland resists aggression, our country will definitely send a military advisory group and even some volunteer troops to help you. I think they definitely don't want to encounter the Prussians in the Polish army. On the contrary, the Prussians should be the same. Prince Poniatowski's expression was solemn and entangled. The French Crown Prince's meaning was obvious. He had to choose between France and Prussia. Joseph felt that he was simply worried about Poland. He was obviously helping them, but he had to coax them like a child. When he saw that the prince remained silent, he continued, oh, by the way, I'm planning to invest in the port of Gdansk with an initial investment of 4 million francs, and more will be added later depending on the situation. You know, our country's trade volume with the German region is increasing, and Gdansk will become an important distribution port for our country's goods. This time, Prince Poniatowski did not hesitate at all, and immediately nodded with a smile. Then that's great. Do you have any additional conditions? No conditions, just invest and get shares in the port. It's that simple. Joseph said. Prince Poniatowski was overjoyed. He had expected France to demand some trade or port privileges, or even port management rights, as Prussia had done. But I didn't expect it was just a pure investment. He immediately nodded repeatedly. Thank you for your generosity. I will let Count Morakovsky take charge of this matter personally, and I will definitely get a good return on your investment. Poland is now using all its wealth to prepare for war. If someone can invest in the field of people's livelihood, he will naturally be happy to see the results. Joseph's main purpose was to stop the Prussian army in Gdansk. For Prussia, the significance of acquiring this seaport was far greater than occupying several Polish provinces. Since the Poles were undefended against Prussia, they had no choice but to help them themselves at the same time. This deal is definitely not a loss for France. Gdansk is the shipping entrance that controls most of the Eastern European market. Although I say I don't want any privileges after the investment, at least French merchant ships will be able to get better services here, and there will definitely be no need to queue up when docking. And when a war breaks out here, France will become a good brother in saving Gdansk. Even if France doesn't want the privileges by then, the local councils there will rush to give them to them. Joseph continued. In addition, I also want to help Warsaw build an ordnance factory to produce Charleville flintlocks and cannons. Prince Poniatowski simply didn't know what to say. Poland's military production capacity has not been improved, and the reason is naturally that there is no money to invest in gun factories and cannon foundries after the expansion of the Tarnowskaya silver mine. The Polish government's purse was finally not so empty, but the allocation of funds to build a gun factory was also planned for 3 years later unexpectedly. The French crown prince was so anxious about his own needs that he directly invested in building an arms factory. If this factory can be put into production before the Russian invasion, Poland will be more confident when facing the enemy. You know, Poland's current firearms self-sufficiency rate is less than 30%, and a large number of flintlock rifles and ammunition need to be purchased from foreign countries, not to mention large artillery. He remembered something very important and asked hurriedly, Your Highness, the funding for this arsenal. I'm afraid the Polish government can't provide much. Joseph waved his hand nonchalantly. Don't worry, the French Reserve will provide you with low-interest loans, as well as craftsmen and technicians. Of course, in order to avoid unnecessary diplomatic troubles, the funding and technology sources of the arsenal must be kept strictly confidential. Of course, I can assure you. By the way, one more thing, the investment in the port and the arsenal will use franc banknotes. Chapter 652. The result we want. Prince Poniatowski nodded without hesitation. Of course, Your Highness. Of course. In francs, Poland is now like a family of 8 with only half a loaf of black bread left. If someone gives them a bite, they will be grateful. Do they mind if there is not enough salt in the rice? Google searched what's more, the franc is very strong now and is widely circulated in Germany and Italy. I heard that the recent steam engine transaction in Upper Hesse was paid with franc banknotes. That's a business worth millions of francs, which is enough to prove the purchasing power of the franc. That's it. Joseph smiled and gestured to the teacup on the table. Please try it. The Wu tea just shipped from the Far East. Oh, by the way, what about the Prussian officers mentioned earlier? Prince Poniatowski hesitated for half a second, then smiled and said, I will discuss with them and let them transfer to the recruitment office to serve as instructors for new recruits. On one side is Prussia, which has always been good at talking but not doing, and even constantly demands the management rights of Gdansk. On the other side is France, which has invested a lot of real money and actively supported Poland in resisting aggression. Is it necessary to choose which side? As for the few Prussian officers who have contributed to Poland, just give them high standard treatment to make up for it. As the prince said. He picked up the teacup and took a sip. The green tea without milk made him frown slightly, but the special fragrance immediately filled his mouth. He looked at the clear tea and asked curiously, Wu, that's a big mountain in the east, producing top grade tea. Oh, it's what we often call bohé. No wonder it's so fragrant. Thank you for your hospitality. However, this way of drinking is really rare. Oriental people like to drink it this way. In fact, they don't even add sugar. Joseph also took a sip of tea and continued, "You seem to have mentioned the training of new recruits just now. Excuse me, the training method of the Prussian army is actually quite backward. Well, maybe I should help you build another military school." It took a whole morning for Joseph and Prince Poniatowski to basically finalize all the general directions of Poland. They had a quick lunch at the Royal Ordnance Factory. In the afternoon, the two of them came to the temporary combat meeting room together in the hall. Officers of the general staff such as Berthier and several senior Polish generals headed by the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, Wacław Radziecki, had been waiting here for a long time. It was just that Radziecki and Kosciuszko and others were all wearing diplomats or attendants' clothes, and they obviously came to France in secret. There was no extra courtesy. After the officers stood up and saluted, the meeting went straight to the point. As the host of the meeting, Berthier stood up and said, "At present, everyone should be very clear about the situation on the Eastern Front. According to the most optimistic estimate, Poland will face 100,000 Russian troops. What is more likely to happen is that 120,000 to 150,000 Russian soldiers will invade the Eastern Front. At the same time, other countries will take advantage of the situation." He had already learned about the results of the discussion between His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and the Prince of Poland, so he simply did not mention the Prussian army. Zewski immediately looked worried when he heard this, and continued, "The situation is indeed very serious. At present, we are arranging defenses along the line from Valin to Minsk. The main defense strategy is to strive for." He was just halfway through his words when he saw the French Crown Prince suddenly stand up and stride to the map of Eastern Europe hanging on the west wall of the conference hall. "You are." Then, under the surprised eyes of everyone, Joseph grabbed a pen and drew a thick black vertical line on the map of Poland. The line runs through Minsk and Valin, cutting Poland in two like a knife. He slapped the right side of the vertical line, which was the southeast corner of Poland, and shouted in an angry and suppressed voice, "Is this what you want to see? Behind the defense line of Volyn, watching the Russians wreak havoc on your land, taking away half of Poland's land, enslaving the Polish people on the west bank of the Dnieper River and Podolia, forcing them to kneel on the ground and call themselves Russians, and pay tribute to the Tsar with their meager income. Is this what you want?" The hall was dead silent. All the Polish officers, including Prince Poniatowski, lowered their heads, but their hands were shaking slightly. "Answer me," Joseph roared. "You only want half of Poland." "No." Kosciuszko stood up with red eyes. "We don't want to lose an inch of land. Even if I have to exchange my life, I don't want the damned Tsarist Russia to set foot in Poland." Other officers also shouted, "It is our responsibility to protect Poland. We don't want to lose our territory. I only want a complete Poland." Prince Poniatowski also stood up and was about to say something excitedly, but suddenly froze and became a little depressed. "Your Highness, please believe that every Pole is unwilling to give up the southeastern territory, but Russia is too powerful and we can't stop them at Ovrach or Moscow. My soldiers and I are not afraid of sacrifice, but we don't want to die in vain. Fighting the Russians on the eastern border will consume our limited military strength, and in the end even Warren will not be able to hold it." As one of Poland's best generals, he has a very clear understanding of the strength of the two armies historically. After Russia launched the Second War to carve up Poland, the Lithuanian front on the northern Polish front only lasted 19 days before being defeated. The southern front, under the command of Prince Poniatowski, resisted for 1 month and 14. By the end of the day, the Russian vanguard had arrived at the gates of Warsaw. At present, although Poland's military strength has improved significantly compared with its history, and is more fully prepared, it is still impossible to defeat the Russian army on the barren and unfavorable eastern border. Joseph looked around at the angry and depressed Polish officers, and said word by word, "Since we can't hold it, let's change our style of play. We will definitely let the Russians know that Poland is invincible." Kosciuszko was keenly aware of the meaning of the French Crown Prince's words and immediately raised his head. "You mean there are other tactics?" Joseph nodded decisively, took a few steps to the side, and then motioned to Berthier. The chief of general staff came to the map and began to describe the combat deployment meticulously. In fact, as early as half a month ago, the French General Staff had formulated several combat plans suitable for Poland. After seeing these plans, Joseph discovered depressingly that even the best situation could only resist the Russian army for 3 or 4 years, and would eventually lead to the Battle of Warsaw. But this is not the result he wants at all. Chapter 653 for victory. Joseph knew very well that Russia's strategic goal this time was not to eat Poland in one bite, but to occupy several Eastern Orthodox provinces. Therefore, the Battle of Warsaw will not occur. Once Poland retreats westward, the Russian army will stop attacking and begin to digest the occupied land. The defeat of the army will make it difficult for the Polish government not to accept the armistice agreement. In addition, once the Russian army gained an advantage, Prussia would immediately stab Poland in the back. Therefore, Poland must defend its eastern territory, otherwise it will repeat the second partition of Poland in history. But how to stop the Russian army seems to be an unsolvable problem, as Berthier continued to tell the whole battle plan. The eyes of the Polish officers became wider and wider. In this way, we can form a confrontation with Russia. The Russians will have no choice but to cease the war as their losses increase day by day. Rewitsky swallowed and subconsciously said, Is this too radical? Joseph immediately said, no, please believe that this is the only way to save Poland. Yes, this was the tactic he finally decided on. He chose the most radical one from the many combat plans of the staff, and then combined it with the classic battle examples of later generations to make it more radical. Finally, it was left to Berthier and his staff to complete the specific tactical design. As a weak side, Poland must be able to risk its life in order to have a chance of survival. And he knew that, even if this plan ultimately failed, the result would not be worse than the result of passive defense. Moreover, neither Russia nor Prussia, Austria, or even other Western European countries want Russia to have direct contact with Central European countries. Therefore, Poland is never in danger of being destroyed. In this case, why not give it a try? And once this mad dog posture is successful, it can have a very good deterrent effect, causing Prussia and Austria to retreat in spite of difficulties. But Poniatowski and his officers were looking at each other, and they all saw in each other's eyes, why are these French people more radical than us? Your Highness, if we fight like this, the middle route army may be very dangerous, or even. Kosciuszko took a deep breath and calmly interrupted, I think His Highness's plan is very good. To be honest, this is the first time in recent times that I have seen hope of preserving the East. I'm willing to serve as the commander of the Central Route Army. Joseph took a deep look at this great Polish national hero. Some heroes need the right circumstances to achieve success, while some heroes will radiate dazzling light. No matter what the situation is, there is no doubt that Kosciuszko is the latter. Historically, after Poland was destroyed, he refused to accept the king's surrender order and came to Lesser Poland alone to call on the people there to revolt. After that, he led more than 10,000 rebels equipped with spears, axes and even sickles, defeated Tsarist Russia's encirclement and suppression several times, and ignited the flames of the uprising throughout Poland. It can be said that he is the Polish version of Janway. Although his uprising ultimately failed under the joint suppression of Russia, and Austria, it was the most bloody chapter in the Polish resistance war. But now, this national hero has stepped forward without hesitation, taking on the most dangerous combat mission with a desperate belief. A Polish officer then stood up. Come on, let's have a good fight with the Russians. Rewitsky also clenched his fists and said, I also think we can try it. All the officers immediately looked at Prince Poniatowski. The latter thought for a moment and said to Joseph, Your Highness, with our current strength, it may be difficult to stop the Russian army. In other words, the Russian army may have already broken through Warsaw before our tactics take effect. Joseph nodded. So you have to expand the army as soon as possible. After the military academy in Warsaw is completed, the army expansion should be faster. Also, don't forget the 10 million people in Poland. As long as they are mobilized, even if they lack training, they can still cause the Russian army a lot of headaches. The Prince of Poland frowned and said hesitantly, we shouldn't place our hopes on ordinary people, who usually only care about their humble lives. In fact, under Joseph's previous arrangements, Polish nationalism has spread widely in the past 2 years, and the anti-invasion enthusiasm among the people is extremely high. However, the prince was used to armies supported by nobles, so he inevitably lacked confidence. Joseph said firmly, "Please believe me, you will definitely be able to recruit the troops you need. Moreover, in the most critical situation, you still have a powerful weapon that can be used." "What's that?" Joseph glanced at the other Polish officers. "I will tell you when the time comes." The next afternoon point in the VIP seats at the Royal Arena in Paris, Prince Poniatowski heard the voice of the scorer, Natorski, 25 meters. He had no intention of watching the game, and his mind was always occupied with the crazy plan of the French General Staff. Poland would probably be destroyed after this battle point, or succumbing to the ravages of war. At this moment, the referee on the field raised the wooden sign with the result of the game, and the commentators around him immediately shouted, "Results of the discus competition. American athlete Simmons 24.4 meters. Polish athlete Natolski 26 meters. Sardinian athlete." In order to let all the audience hear, there are 12 commentators in the stadium, each responsible for an area point. After the results were read out, the commentators said in unison, "The Polish player won the final victory. Poland won." Prince Poniatowski suddenly shook his body and felt a passion full of pride surged into his chest. "Poland won," he whispered. "Poland won, yes, won." He stood up slowly, and the hesitation in his heart had disappeared without a trace. Point for victory, for the pride of being a Pole just now. "Let's duel with the invaders." Caribbean Sea. Barbados. "General, you should change the medicine," a military doctor reminded outside the tent. General Brand, the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, glanced at the Frenchman sitting opposite him, and winked at his attendant unhappily. "Shut him up." Then he turned to the French envoy and said, "Mr. Brissett, £100,000 is too much. It's just a small-scale battle. There is also a ship and necessary supplies." Brissett corrected. "Yes, the negotiator is him." He did not hide the news that he came to Saint-Domingue on behalf of the French government, because he announced to the outside world that he came to suppress the abolitionist uprising. Brand frowned. "You see, our army has won the victory, and I can go to the Bahamas myself. This is the minimum condition for our army, to go to the Bahamas, to help you suppress the riots." Brissett looked calm. "The soldiers took a great risk to leave Fort Magua." Brand looked at him with a look of confidence, and he was itching with hatred. However, he had no other choice. His thousands of troops had been fighting the Barbadian black rebels for several months. Although they had won a victory with great difficulty, the casualties among the soldiers were serious, and their physical strength and energy were greatly depleted, so they had to take a long rest. And the rebel parliament in the Bahamas was already about to start electing a president. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 654, The Guide of Freedom. In the end, Brand compromised. After all, the niggas in the Bahamas are just clamoring for independence, and they actually create a government structure and control the administration and economy of the entire island. The degree of harm is completely different. By then, he will have to take full responsibility as the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force. As for the reinforcement, the news he received last week is that preparations have not yet been completed, and it will take 4 months at the earliest before 5,000 soldiers arrive at the Caribbean. Before that, he needed someone to help him stabilize the situation in the Bahamas. At least the rebel government could not easily confiscate the island's plantations and drive out the British. And the commission to the French was naturally paid by the governor of the Bahamas. Lord Essex took a lot of money with him when he fled Nassau. That afternoon, Brissett took the British transport ship Smile loaded with supplies and returned to Saint-Domingue. The ship was called upon by him in the following months. This was one of the conditions for helping the British suppress the Bahamas uprising. As for France's own transport ship, it was hijacked by the Saint-Domingue rebels 3 months ago. Brisset first docked at the French-controlled island of St. Lucia, replaced French crew members, and then continued northwestward. After the Smile left the Lesser Andres Islands, the crew brought a black man from the French coolie who had previously boarded the ship to the officers' conference room. Brisset stood up and bowed to the man in ragged clothes, but with sharp eyes, and said in English, "Nice to see you here, Mr. Jones." Jones was the leader of the abolitionist movement in the Bahamas. After his rebel army was defeated, he was taken to the island of Santa Lucia by a ship of the Special Trade Association. He raised his hand and touched his chest in return. "They said you were a Morga's man, so be it." Jones nodded. "If you can give me a pistol and send me back to Bridgeton, I will be very grateful to you." "What are you going to do?" "David is dead. Gerard is dead. Old John is dead. Everyone is dead." Jones stared at Brisset tightly and said in a hoarse voice, "I have to avenge them. As long as I have a gun, I can. You can also kill a lot of British people and then go to meet them there." Brisset nodded silently. "Although you have encountered some setbacks, the cause of freedom and liberation has not failed." Jones shouted, "Liberty forever. I'll send you back to Bridgeton, but not to assassinate British soldiers." "Then what else can I do?" "Kneel down to the white man and beg for forgiveness." "No, there are still hundreds of thousands of enslaved people waiting for you to rescue." Brisset said, "Your cause of freedom will continue." Jones smiled miserably. "The brothers who followed me are all dead, and no one can save me now." "What if I could provide you with 1,000 flintlock muskets and £50,000? Jones's eyes lit up. You're not joking, are you?" Of course not." Brisset patted him on the shoulder. "The weapons will be delivered by ship in 3 days, and the money is in the cabin below. The cause of freedom will never end." Just like that, Brand just paid half of the £100,000 was transferred to the abolitionist rebel army to support the struggle against the British. A few days later, Brisset stood on the bow of the ship and looked at Jones's back in the distance, feeling a surge of emotion. "That is the fire of freedom. It is not extinguished yet. It will continue to burn with that man throughout Barbados, and one day liberate the people who are enslaved and tortured there." He turned to look at the boundless sea. On the other side of the Caribbean, black people in the Bahamas and Jamaica are also resisting their tragic fate, using their blood and hands to bury the dirty slavery system. Then, Saint-Domingue will lead the entire Caribbean region to establish a country of freedom. No oppression, and no slave trade. Whether they are black, white, or mulatto, they can live there equally and show the same bright smile. The long night of sin ends here. The light of freedom and happiness will always shine on the boundless Caribbean Sea. Brisset suddenly crossed himself on his chest, raised his head and said loudly, "Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. It is you who have brought hope to this land. May God bless you." He was a fanatical abolitionist who came to America on a slave ship and then witnessed with his own eyes the miserable life of black slaves. Those West African tribesmen were raided, captured, and transported to the Americas by slave caravans. Nearly a quarter of the people will die along the way. What awaits them is to work non-stop in Liege, driven by the manor owner's whip. If you are not careful, you will be tortured by being burned, hung upside down, or even directly executed. Female black slaves would be humiliated by plantation owners at any time, and at any time. Slave owners would also pen them together like animals and select strong black men for unified breeding. The black children born to them would be the private property of the slave owners and continue their lives as slaves and livestock. The fate of the black slaves kept reincarnating like this, like falling into hell, with no hope. Until His Royal Highness the Crown Prince sent him here. Countless innocent black people have since escaped the whips of plantation owners, become human beings again, and are bathed in the holy light of God again. Brisset's eyes were a little red. He swore in his heart that he would always follow His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Follow the guide of freedom, and give him everything he had. Half a month later, a French anti-rebellion army of 4,000 people landed in the Bahamas. The Bahamas Provisional Parliament suddenly became nervous and immediately authorized Major Toussaint Louverture and Lidington to summon troops to resist. Of course, Several absolute high-ranking officials in the parliament and the two commanders of the rebels had already met with Oger's envoys and knew that this French army was not an enemy. The two sides even had to cooperate. French Commander Lieutenant Colonel Galissonier pointed to the city of Nassau in the distance and smiled at Major Gardner, a British military advisor beside him. These blacks have no military common sense. You see, it took me less than 2 days to complete the siege of this city. I wish you victory as soon as possible. Gardner said. His so-called consultant was actually here to be a military supervisor to prevent the French from taking money without working. At noon the next day, the French army launched a fierce attack on Nassau. For a while, the sound of artillery was deafening. The buildings outside Nassau were quickly torn apart by artillery shells. Then, the French infantry line advanced neatly towards the city under the urging of the military drums. Just as Gardner was amazed at the French army's strong fighting power and the black slaves were unable to fight back, the sound of trumpets suddenly sounded from the sides and rear of the two wings of the French army. Chapter 655 Script. Two groups of black soldiers instantly rushed out of the dense forests on both sides of Nassau, shouting and killing the French army that was attacking the city. At the same time, bursts of artillery fire were heard in Nassau, and the French infantry's advance immediately slowed down. Gardner looked at the black soldiers loading cannons in the telescope in shock, and said in disbelief, how come they have cannons? Galissonier issued a series of transfer orders to his staff, turned back, and said with a livid face, the most important thing is, they can actually fire. His acting skills are so great that the British can't see any flaws in him. In fact, it was the artillery officer under his command who secretly came to the Bahamas a few months ago and taught the black soldiers step by step how to use the artillery. Nowadays, although there is no hope for the hit rate of these Bahamian artillerymen, they can at least operate the cannon skillfully, and their momentum is extremely bluffing. Not long after, a cavalryman covered in blood galloped over and reported in a panic, Lord Lieutenant Colonel, our right wing was attacked by niggers and suffered heavy casualties. Gardner hurriedly raised his telescope and looked, and saw the French army fleeing in panic under the bursts of gunpowder smoke, with countless black people chasing after them. The black soldiers hardly had many flintlock guns, and most of them wielded machetes for cutting sugar cane. He cursed secretly, and took back all his previous words about the French army's strong combat power. But he soon remembered that his General Brand had also been defeated by these niggers, and he felt relieved. Lieutenant Colonel Galissonier soon received news of the army's defeat, and finally gritted his teeth, and ordered to leave an infantry battalion behind, and the others immediately retreated south. At dusk, Gardner followed the French army, and retreated to a beach. The black troops finally retreated slowly. After several officers solemnly reported the losses of the troops to Galissonier, Gardner suddenly felt nervous. The French army had lost nearly 1,000 soldiers, and almost all its artillery and horses. Then, a staff officer walked into the tent, pointed at the map, and said to Galissonier, "Sir, here, and here have been occupied by rebels. I have asked soldiers to start building defensive positions. There are at least 5,000 to 6,000 black people around us." In fact, the French army had no real casualties at all. Most of the 1,000 soldiers lost were captured, and were having dinner in Nassau. The food is quite rich. There were only about 3,000 Bahamian soldiers around, and they had received strict orders from La Virge not to fight the French army without authorization. Everything is a script that has already been drawn up. However, Galissonier acted as if he was frightened, and sent 3 groups of people to Saint-Domingue for help. Then he grabbed Gardner and said anxiously, "I'm here to help you put down the rebellion. You must not ignore it, please. Write to the governor of Jamaica and ask him to send troops here, for God's sake." Listening to the painful groans of the wounded soldiers outside, Gardner was afraid that he would also be killed by the black slaves, so he hurriedly wrote a letter asking for help and gave it to the messenger. The staff officer next to him said, "By the way, we can also ask the Spaniards on Juan Island for help." The lights were on all night long in Galissonier's tent. Early the next morning, there was no response to the call for help. Instead, Santo Domingo sent someone to ask for help. Galissonier looked at the visitor with wide eyes and said in shock, "You mean the Magua fortress was breached by the rebels?" "Yes, sir. After you led your army to leave, the rebels launched a fierce attack on the fortress. They broke into the outer perimeter of the fortress at noon yesterday. The Marquis of La Valletrie asked you to go back immediately, otherwise the expeditionary force will be driven into the sea. Gallisonia was stunned for a few seconds, then pointed at Gardner and shouted, "It's all you. If it weren't for helping you deal with the Bahamian rebels, nothing would happen to Magua. Let Brand come to reinforce Santo Domingo immediately, quickly, soon." The entire Caribbean army was worried about Santo Domingo. Mingo's French army fell, and moved at the same time. The governor of Jamaica, Lord Cumberland, sent 800 troops to assist the Bahamas. The Spaniards on Juan Island dispatched nearly 1,000 soldiers to Santo Domingo. The Bahamas island belongs to the British, and is more worthy of saving than the French island. After Brand received the letter, he had to order the British Expeditionary Force, which had just breathed a sigh of relief, to board the transport ship and go to Saint Domingue to reinforce the French. In his opinion, the interests of the three countries of Britain, France, and Spain are completely consistent at present, so they must try to keep Saint Domingue and get back the previous £100,000. However, when the British fleet was only half a day away from Port-au-Prince, shocking news came from Magua. Nearly 4,000 soldiers of the French Expeditionary Force surrendered to Auga on the British Expeditionary Force flagship Black Mountains. Brand was slapping the table and shouting angrily, "The French are trash. They surrendered to those niggers. Aren't they ashamed, eh?" Whistle came from the mast, which meant that a battleship was approaching. Not long after, an officer walked into the cabin and said to Brand, "General, this is Count Marbauli, the governor of Santo Domingo. He wants to see you." "He escaped?" "Yes, General. It seems the Spaniards saved him. Bring him in." "Forget it. I'll go there myself." On the deck of the Black Mountains, Count Mably said to Brand with a dark face, "If you hadn't taken away the garrison in Magua, those blacks wouldn't have been able to break through the fortress." The Spanish officer on the side also looked gloomy. "I think you have an obligation to rescue the thousands of French troops in the Bahamas. Then, we will join forces to suppress the rebellion in Saint Domingo." Brand nodded immediately. "Let's go to the Bahamas now." 3 days later, a total of 3,700 soldiers from the British and Spanish coalition forces successfully landed on the Bahamas, dispersed the black rebels who surrounded the French, and made contact with the French army. When Lieutenant Colonel Gallisonia saw Brand, he immediately anxiously asked him to go with him to recapture Saint Domingo Island. However, the latter proposed that the rebels in Nassau should be defeated first, and then go to Saint Domingo, so that the Bahamas could be used as a logistics supply base. The French were finally convinced. In fact, according to the script, even if Brand didn't say that he would attack Nassau first, he would say that, in order to thank the British army for saving him, Nassau should be recaptured first. The three-nation coalition army did not make much preparations. 7,000 troops against the inferior blacks. It is not easy to win, and rushed to Nassau. It seems that the last defeat has left a psychological shadow on Lieutenant Colonel Gallisonia. This time he strongly requested the British army to attack in the front, and he was responsible for the two wings in the rear. Seeing that he looked timid, Brand agreed without thinking much. The next day, Nassau was surrounded by thousands of troops from three directions again. Chapter 656 Caribbean Independence Wave. The British cannon began to roar the black rebel army in Nassau. "Oh, it should be called the Bahamas National Army now." Also immediately responded with cannons. Last time, Gallisonia sent them 10 cannons. Adding in the previous wealth, there were 17 cannons in the city at this time, and their firepower was even more powerful than the British. General Brand continued to urge his troops to press forward. Based on his experience in fighting the black rebels in the past few months, as long as his soldiers can get close to within the range of the flintlock, they can quickly defeat the enemy with their absolute superior training and equipment level. Even if their own number was only half or even a quarter of the opponent's, those niggers didn't have the guts to shoot at the British army. What's more, he has a huge military advantage this time. It was only a matter of time before the city of Nassau was retaken. In the temporary command post of the French army, Lieutenant Colonel Gallisonia used his binoculars to see that the British army was very close to the Bahamas National Army's defense line. He turned to look to his side and behind, and could not help but frown slightly. At this moment, a burst of gunfire came from the southeast side. Gallisonia's brows immediately relaxed. He picked up the pipe and pen on the small table, and put them in his pocket. Not long after, a messenger came on horseback and shouted, "General, our flank is under attack. The enemy has more than 2,000 infantry and a small number of cavalry." Gallisonia nodded and said to the staff calmly, "Send the order, the 17th Infantry Regiment, and the Cheryl Infantry Regiment to withdraw to the port. The cavalry should pay attention to cover." "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel," the staff officer responded, but was suddenly stunned. "You mean, retreat?" "Yes, the enemy's offensive is too fierce. If we continue to persist, our army will suffer huge casualties." But Gallisonia shouted, "Immediately execute the order, Captain Bertrand. By the way, tell the officers to try not to conflict with the enemy. The most important thing is to save the lives of the soldiers. Leave the rest to the British." "This is, Lieutenant Colonel." Soon, the 3,000 French troops responsible for defending the flanks began to retreat eastward, while the Bahamas National Army did not entangle with them at all, and instead attacked the British troops who were mainly attacking from the front. Brand naturally heard the gunshots from both wings. Although he was a little surprised that the niggers had launched a flank attack, he didn't take it to heart. There will definitely be no problem with thousands of French troops defending the niggers. It only takes 2 or 3 hours for his side to break through the defense line of Nassau City and then turn around to deal with the enemies on the flanks. The more likely scenario is that the French army joined him in defeating the Negro army. Suddenly, a continuous sound of trumpets was heard from the direction of Nassau, followed by intensive military drums. Brand raised his telescope and looked, and saw a large number of black soldiers forming a crooked line and rushing out of the city. "These stupid niggers." A sneer appeared on Brand's lips. If the black rebels had been hiding behind the defense line, they might have lost hundreds of soldiers before they could invade Nassau City, but they dared to rush out at this time. If faced head on, your own soldiers can defeat the nigger in an instant. Definitely win. Just as Brigadier General Brand was formulating his speech after entering Nassau, he felt that the gunfire from both wings seemed to be getting closer and closer. He frowned and raised his telescope again, but was shocked to find that chaos began to appear on the left wing of the British infantry line. "What's going on?" A ranger hurried over and said anxiously, "Report. The French army on the left was defeated by the rebels. More than 1,000 rebels are approaching our infantry line." Brand was horrified and hurriedly mobilized his reserves to fill the hole on the left wing. At the same time, he cursed in a low voice, "Are the French all trash? They can't even defeat a group of niggers." Just as his more than 600 reserves began to line up and turn, at this time, another officer came to report that the French army on the right had also begun to collapse, and thousands of black rebels also appeared there. Brand's face suddenly turned pale. At 3 p.m., the 1,300 British soldiers under Nassau dropped their weapons and surrendered to the Bahamas National Army. The British were fully confident that they could defeat the poorly trained blacks in a head-on attack, but they faced being surrounded on 3 sides. In order to make the attack sudden, Louverture did not even allow the black soldiers to form a formation. He rushed directly into the British Army's line formation from the side and rear, and tore each British soldier into pieces with machetes and axes under the cover of the cavalry. Brand barely escaped to the beach in the south of the Bahamas, which happened to be the camp left behind when Gallisonia's French army was defeated last time. There were less than 1,000 soldiers left around him. The situation on the Spanish side was slightly better. The Bahamian rebels were obviously not interested in them. They only caught the British troops and beat them hard, allowing them to withdraw most of their soldiers at dusk. Black people in Nassau took to the streets holding torches to celebrate their hard-won victory. Members of the abolitionist movement could be seen everywhere standing on high places, giving speeches. Yes, our French friends who advocate freedom and equality did not want to see us enslaved, and voluntarily withdrew from the battlefield to give us a chance to defeat the British. The French army came to the Bahamas under pressure from the British. They never fired a shot at us from beginning to end. In fact, there have always been French friends who have been secretly transporting ammunition to us. This is the guidance of public opinion arranged by the Bahamas Parliament at the request of the Abolition League in Saint-Domingue. Similar propaganda is also being carried out in places such as Jamaica and the Lesser Andres Islands. Joseph spent so much energy to help the black people in the Caribbean regain their freedom, but he couldn't just get their hatred in the end. What he wanted was gratitude. It was the dependence of these newly established countries in the Caribbean on France, and the return point with the huge influence of Saint Domingo in the Caribbean abolition movement. It was not difficult to guide public opinion. 2 days later, the Republic of the Bahamas held a national election with the victory of the Battle of Nassau. In fact, the Bahamas is far from building an effective administrative system. The control of the parliament is basically around Nassau. So the election ended in just 3 days. A total of more than 60,000 people voted, and Kenneth Lidington, the commander of the Bahamian rebels, was elected as the first president. La Virtue, a Saint Domingo, actually received more than 50,000 votes. The Bahamas adopted the American model, with more than one vote per person, but he finally declined the invitation to serve as vice president. On the other hand, Saint Domingo also started the general election. Compared to the Bahamas, the parliament here has been in operation for a long time and has formed effective management of various cities, so the election process is longer. However, Oja's name has long spread throughout the Caribbean, and all black slaves regard him as a savior, so his victory is almost a foregone conclusion. In Jamaica, after several months of operation, Oriel has gathered an army of 1,500 people again. Chapter 657 Political Gains. Oriel had recently received £50,000 from the Abolition League of Saint-Domingue. Yes, it was exactly what the British had previously paid to Brissett, and used this money to purchase troops. Required logistics supplies then, taking advantage of the fact that the governor of Jamaica sent troops to reinforce the Bahamas. He led his army to invade Kingston again. Jones returned to Barbados with the vow of revenge and £50,000. He originally thought that he would have to lie dormant for a period of time before he could resume his resistance to the great cause. But he did not expect that the British would leave Barbados soon after and went to reinforce the Bahamas. How could Jones miss such a good opportunity? He immediately summoned hundreds of black soldiers and began to attack sugarcane plantations. In this way, the independence movement in the entire Caribbean region was like a huge wave swept up by a hurricane, showing an unstoppable momentum. In the officer conference room of the third-class battleship Black Mountain of the British Expeditionary Force, Brand was holding the table with both hands and yelling at Lieutenant Colonel Gallisonier, sitting opposite, "If it weren't for your incompetence and cowardice, you will never be defeated by those niggers. You and the French government are all responsible for the situation in the Bahamas." As he spoke, he glanced at the Spanish commander Garcia Cortez, obviously trying to get his support. Lieutenant Colonel Gallisonier sneered and countered with a louder voice, "Who bribed that greedy envoy to transfer my troops from the Magua fortress to reinforce Nassau? It's you. Your stupid behavior led to the loss of Magua. My soldiers learned that they had lost their supply base, which led to low morale, and they happened to be attacked by niggers. You are the one responsible for all this." Courts also looked at Brand. "At that time, we should have gone to reinforce Magua first. Facts have proved that your combat deployment was wrong. You guys." Gallisonier interrupted him coldly. "Our government will protest to the United Kingdom on this matter." Cortez shook his head. "General Brand, your series of mistakes have caused the situation in the entire Caribbean to deteriorate." At the same time, the Republic of Saint-Domingue finally elected its first president. Vincent Auger was elected without any surprise. On the day after his inauguration, he and senior government officials held a very important meeting with Brissett in the Parliament building. There is no doubt that this is a victory for freedom and equality. Brissett took the lead in an impassioned speech, "And this is a great and hopeful country. Congratulations to you, and congratulations to the Republic of Saint-Domingue. This is all due to the kindness of His Majesty the King and the guidance of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Auger said politely, "Saint Domingo, and even the liberated people in the entire Caribbean, will always remember them." Other Santo Domingo officials also spoke excitedly, expressing their gratitude to France in various ways. After some polite remarks, Auger got down to business. Dear Mr. Envoy, you know that the newly established republic still faces extremely difficulties. The first is the military threat from Britain and Spain. He wasn't exaggerating at all. Although Saint-Domingue is a French colony, it is currently the center of the abolitionist movement in the Caribbean. If the British wanted to suppress the abolitionist organizations in their colonies, they had to first eliminate this command center point. Therefore, after the next batch of British expeditionary forces arrives in the Caribbean, there is a high probability that they will attack Saint-Domingue first point at the same time. Spain may also join the British Army in order to protect its island Juan from the abolitionist movement. Brissett nodded and said, with a smile, since our expeditionary force has surrendered, all their weapons and equipment will be left to you. This is enough for you to arm an army of tens of thousands of people. I will also go to the United States and try to get some more weapons. You need to use these months to recruit as many soldiers as you can, and I believe that rebel armies in other areas will also try to reinforce you. Thank you for your generosity. A mixed-race man in his 40s and somewhat bolstered up, but the Congress simply cannot afford enough military expenditures to maintain such a large army. Brissett knew that he was Straw, the new finance minister of Saint-Domingue, and immediately nodded and said, you don't need to worry about this. In fact, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has approved a loan of 5 million francs for Saint-Domingue. This is enough to support you defeated the British. The military expenditure of 5 million francs is not enough in Europe, but it is a huge amount of money in the Caribbean. Black soldiers hardly need salary and only need to be provided with food and accommodation, and they are willing to pick up guns and fight against the British. Because once they were defeated, they had to return to the plantations as slaves, or even be hanged directly by the British. At the same time, military supplies such as military uniforms, leather boots, and tents can also be omitted. All 5 million was used to purchase food and ammunition, which was enough for an army of 10,000 to consume for 1 or 2 years. Orge and others immediately showed excitement. This is great. As long as we have military spending, we will definitely be able to defend Santo Domingo. Thank you, His Highness the Crown Prince, for being the leader of freedom. Straw asked cautiously, Mr. Brissett, how much is the interest on this loan? You know, Saint-Domingue has experienced such a turmoil, and the finances will probably be very tight. 33%. Brissett said, Saint-Domingo's debt repayment risk is very high, and it will be difficult for His Highness to get the bank to lower the interest rate. Straw nodded silently. He knew that Saint-Domingo, as a new country, had to be an enemy of Britain, and apart from France, there was no other country willing to lend money to it. But such a high interest rate was almost unbearable for Saint-Domingo. Brissett seemed to see his concerns and continued, of course, His Highness knew that your financial situation might not be very good, so he specifically instructed me to waive the interest for you. Really, not only Straw, but also Augur and others looked at the French envoy with surprise. Brissett nodded. Of course, your Highness has a small condition. Please tell us. We are willing to serve your Highness at any time. In the next 10 years, the sugar cane produced in Saint-Domingo can only be sold to those who have obtained your Highness's trade license. Brissett added, of course, you don't have to worry about the price. It will not be lower than 70% of the Philadelphia landed price. There will be transportation and labor costs when transporting from Saint-Domingo to Philadelphia, plus the profit of merchants, which usually increase the purchase price by 25% to 30%. So this purchase price is very fair. Orge and the Minister of Finance looked at each other and nodded immediately. Thank you, Your Highness. I think this condition is very reasonable. Chapter 658. One goes down, and the other goes up. Joseph was certain that loans to Caribbean countries were a sure bet. Like the 5 million francs given to the newly formed Republic of Saint-Domingue, it was unlikely that they would be able to pay it off within 10 years, even without interest. The high-level government composed of black and mixed-race people has no experience in governance, and there is no industry in the Caribbean. Therefore, these small island countries cannot develop on their own, let alone repaying the loan. We will be lucky if the national finances do not collapse. Therefore, the loan could ultimately only be repaid by mortgaging the plantation or the like. In this way, France seems to have given up on the colony of Saint-Domingue, but after a full circle, most of the sugar industry here will return to French hands, although the income is definitely not as much as before, and it will no longer be able to monopolize the colonial market in the future. At the same time, France has also saved a lot of investment in maintaining the colonies. For example, there were hundreds of French officials before Saint-Domingue, as well as nearly 2,000 soldiers, and the salaries of these people alone were a lot of money. If there is a riot or something on the island, it will consume huge amounts of money. But now, the black and mixed race people on the island manage themselves, and even if they starve to death, they don't need the French government to pay for the aftermath. Taken together, France's benefits from here will not be much less than before. Moreover, blacks and mixed race people will be grateful to France after gaining freedom and self-government. This kind of gratitude often becomes a tradition in these countries, and will not change for centuries later. Joseph also planned to help these newly established countries develop and impart administrative experience to deepen this gratitude. Of course, the experience imparted will certainly not be detrimental to France. At the same time, because the black slaves in the Caribbean were basically kidnapped from West Africa by Britain, which had a monopoly on the slave trade, black people inherently had a deep hatred for Britain. In addition, in order to maintain the colony this time, Britain sent a large number of troops to fight against the black power, which deepened this hatred. It is foreseeable that QIUing will become a tradition in these countries in the future. Between this entry and exit, France has made a huge profit. On top of everything else, Joseph has a bigger plan, which is to gradually create a sugar franc. The meeting in the Santo Domingo capital continues. Brissett said with a confident expression. As for Spain, I believe that you only need to use some diplomatic means to get them to give up their interference in Santo Domingo. Orge immediately rubbed his hands in embarrassment. Mr. Brissett, you know, we don't have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs yet. As a colony, Saint-Domingue had no need for diplomacy before. When dealing with foreign relations, it just followed the orders sent by Paris. This resulted in the fact that after the new government was established, not even a single qualified diplomat could be found. Brissett comforted him. Your Excellency, President, there is no need to worry about this matter. I can negotiate with the Spanish on behalf of Saint-Domingue. Oh, and then I can also apply to the Palace of Versailles to send a diplomatic expert to assist you. Orge and others were not dissatisfied at all about interference in other countries' internal affairs. Instead, they thanked him profusely. You are really helpful. Thank you, Mr. Brissett. I guarantee that the expert's salary will definitely be higher than when he was in Paris. Aha, now we also have Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Minister of Justice of Santo Domingo stood up hesitantly and said, Mr. Brissett, there is a great shortage of justices in the Republic right now. Although this is a bit difficult, if you can send some judges from Paris, I swear that you will always remember your kindness. Actually, we also need a Minister of Industry. Mr. Brissett, you see, there are also schools. There are only 4 ordinary schools in Santo Domingo, which is far from enough. Mr. Brissett, please, this is also what often happens in colonies in the past. They relied too heavily on the suzerain. After suddenly becoming their own ruler, they found that they couldn't get many things, so they habitually sought help from the original suzerain. In fact, even in the 20th century, after India became independent, a large number of official positions in the government were still held by British people. Brissett hurriedly signaled everyone to calm down, and then said to Augur, Your Excellency, you can first make statistics of your government's needs. I will then ask His Royal Highness the Crown Prince for instructions. Orge was so excited that he couldn't help but salute. Thank you so much, Mr. Brissett. You are truly the patron saint of Santo Domingo. After talking about the new government, Brissett put on a serious expression again. I must remind you that Santo Domingo still faces a difficult battle. If the British Expeditionary Force cannot be defeated, everything today will be in vain. On the contrary. As long as you defeat the British this time, the French government will immediately recognize the Republic of Saint-Domingue, Auger, and others were immediately overjoyed. Being recognized by a big country like France means that the new government has a solid foundation to gain a foothold in the international community. A week later, Juan Island, Havana City Point Brissett complained angrily to Juan Governor Cristobal de Rojas, "Damn the British, they ruined Saint-Domingue with their stupid battle plan." Marquis Rojas nodded with deep understanding. "My army almost didn't make it back. Britain's mistakes caused the entire Caribbean region to get out of control. What I'm most worried about now is that the abolition movement will spread to Juan. This is indeed very dangerous." Brissett lowered his voice and said, "To be honest, Versailles is likely to give up Saint Domingo in exchange for the safe return of captured soldiers to France." "Oh, God." Rogers nervously made a cross and frowned. "This is terrible. It seems that I must fully cooperate with the British. Although I don't like them, this is the only way to suppress those rioting blacks." Brissett said earnestly, "I'm worried about this, so I came to see you specifically. Out of the deep friendship between France and Spain, I can't watch Juan Island end up like Saint Domingo." "I don't quite understand what you mean." "I remember that Juan's garrison had only more than 1,400 people. Yes, 1,430 soldiers. To be honest, if those people from Saint Domingo come to Juan Island to incite abolitionist riots, your army may not be able to defeat them. And the British army, they haven't even dealt with the blacks in Jamaica and the Bahamas. By the way, I heard that there are rebels in Barbados again." Rogers' eyes showed panic. "I'm afraid His Majesty is unlikely to send an expeditionary force to Juan. At this time, Spain's national strength was weak, and it was indeed difficult to come up with the huge funds to organize a transatlantic military operation." Point Brissett looked at the Spaniard seriously. "If I were you, I would choose to contact those people in Saint Domingo." Chapter 659 Caribbean Confederation. Marquis Rogers' eyes widened and he exclaimed, How can this be possible?" Brissett said, "There are not many black slaves on Juan Island, so those guys in the abolitionist movement don't pay much attention to this place. If you can promise them not to interfere in their affairs, improve the treatment of black slaves on Juan Island, and even cooperate with them privately, it is possible to exchange them for their promise not to interfere in Juan Island. There is nothing to lose by contacting them. Our country is about to leave the Caribbean, and I really don't want to see you facing the same situation." At the same time that Brissett met with the governor of Juan Island, representatives of the abolition movement in Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Lesser Antilles gathered in Saint Domingo to attend the first plenary meeting of the Caribbean Abolition League. Point George stood on the high platform of the Parliament Hall in Port-au-Prince and said passionately to representatives from all over the world, "The road to freedom and liberation has never been smooth. On the contrary, we are facing the death threat from the most powerful and evil country in the world, Britain. Although we have rock-like firm beliefs and the courage to not fear death, there is no doubt that we are still not strong enough. In the face of the devil's army, we can only defeat them and consolidate the results we have achieved if we unite more closely, and if we fight alone, we will most likely be defeated by the British one by one in the end. Our relatives and friends will be shackled again, returned to the damn plantation, and die under the slavery of the whip. Do you want to see this happen?" A tsunami-like roar suddenly erupted in the Parliament Hall. "No, we must not let the devil succeed. No one can take away our freedom. We must unite and teach the British a lesson." Oja and the others gradually quieted down and continued, "According to reliable information, 5,000 British soldiers will arrive in the Caribbean by ship in 3 months. Together with Brand's remnants, we will face 6,500 British troops. In order to better mobilize our forces, only by gathering all our soldiers can we fight the British. I suggest the establishment of a Caribbean military committee to unify the mobilization of troops from all over the country. I call on all fighters who fight for freedom and equality to join this committee. We will use the most sincere unity and fearless spirit to defeat all enemies who want to continue to enslave us." The Bahamian president's envoy was the first to raise his hand and said loudly, "The Republic of the Bahamas will join the military committee. Guard our freedom with our brothers in Saint Domingo." If Saint Domingo had not sent La Virtue with 800 soldiers to reinforce the Bahamas, Nassau would have probably been lost. La Virtue has now been awarded the title of Honorary President of the Bahamas for life, and has a huge influence in the Bahamas, and Augur is his superior, so the Bahamas joined the military committee called by Augur almost without hesitation. Then, the representatives of Jamaica also expressed their willingness to join. The leader of the military commander of the Jamaican abolition movement, Oriel, was also sent by Saint Domingo, and the current rebels in Jamaica are relatively weak and are looking forward to obtaining military assistance from the outside world. Immediately afterwards, St. Vincent and Barbados also agreed to join the military committee. Their rebels have all received the support of St. Domingo's abolitionists. The British abolitionists had received weapons and funding from the slave organizations, and they had cooperated with the British Army to mobilize the British Army before, so they were also happy to establish a military united front. In this way, all blacks and mixed race people in the entire Caribbean region, except for Juan Island, formed a close military organization. Behind them are more than 2.1 million blacks. Even in the three relatively close places of St. Domingo, Jamaica and the Bahamas, there are more than 1.6 million blacks. In addition, there are more than 300,000 mixed race people, most of whom are on the side of the abolitionist organization. The total population has reached 2.4 million. When the American War of Independence broke out, the population was less than 3 million. Augur excitedly raised his arms and shouted, "Long live freedom! Long live the Caribbean Alliance." Dozens of representatives present immediately shouted, "Long live freedom, we will win." Augur was excited as he watched the fiery scene in front of him. With this Caribbean Military Committee as a foundation, the finances of the islands can be gradually integrated through military expenditures and later supplies, thereby maximizing the impact on politics. He has only one goal, which is to establish the Caribbean Confederation. A truly powerful country, and Mr. Brissett has shown him a handwritten letter from the French Crown Prince. As long as the Confederation can be established, it will receive full support from France, Osman. Constantini. Grand Vizier Damat Melka Mohammed smiled at the French foreign minister, who was limping out of the carriage, bowed slightly, and said in fluent French, "I thought you had returned to Paris and submitted our trade agreement to His Majesty the Kingdom." Talleyrand returned the greeting by touching his chest and smiled. "Maybe I fell in love with Constantini. You see, I've only been away for a few days, and I can't wait to come back to find her warmth." He followed Melka Mohammed to the post house next to the palace in a familiar manner, and whispered in a low voice, "To be honest, the trade agreement last time was not enough for me to take back. I swear, that's the most generous terms I can offer. Well, the number of merchant ships will be increased, and the tariffs on textiles and grape juice will be reduced by 2.5%. It's really generous." Talleyrand teased, "This reminds me of the butcher shop downstairs in my house. The boss will sell all the goods that no one wants. I always like to say this when using leftovers as extras." Melka Mohammed stepped into the door, turned his head and said, "You came back from the Mediterranean just to tell me about the butcher shop in Paris, right? If I say that I want to buy a lot of meat this time, such as a whole sheep." Talleyrand followed into the room decorated with colorful geometric patterns, pulled up a chair and sat down. "Then will you give me more?" "Big deal." "Oh, coffee, thank you." Selim III's New Order reforms have been carried out for more than 2 years, which has caused many changes in the Ottomans. For example, chairs began to be accepted by people, and people no longer had to sit on the floor when talking. Melka Mohammed said calmly, "But your family can't eat so much, right? If it's just a business, it would be difficult for me to give you a discount. Look, I have no shortage of customers here." Talleyrand took the coffee from the servant and smiled slightly. "Of course not. Please believe me, I will be your store's biggest customer in the future." Chapter 660 Monopoly on Mediterranean Trade. "I understand your good wishes." Melka Mohammed supported his huge white turban, straightened his back and said, "However, His Majesty the Great Sultan has decided that our country's trade will be fully aligned with the United Kingdom. Talleyrand shook his head. The girl you are obsessed with may still be smiling sweetly at you, but what you may not know is that she turned around and went to have a tryst with your enemy. I mean, the person who robbed the northern Xinjiang Peninsula from your home. The northernmost peninsula of the Ottoman Empire was Crimea, so he was obviously referring to Russia. Malcolm Mohammed narrowed his eyes. The trade between Britain and Russia has always been very close, but this does not affect the increasing number of British merchant ships coming to Constantinople. Moreover, Britain's huge commercial influence on Russia may at some point be used to help us check and balance Russia. Haha. Talleyrand laughed heartily. You actually have expectations for a woman who has changed her heart. Oh, you just mentioned merchant ships. I almost forgot. The main reason I came to see you this time is to talk about the merchant ship. A look of displeasure flashed across the face of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. Although your country has obtained port control of Tunisia and Tripoli through some improper methods, British merchant ships can completely bypass these places. Jaya replenished the rowers and then went straight to Constantinople. I must remind you that our country is only destroying pirates. Moreover, these pirates are all from Anatolia. It was because of our country's just act that the Duke of Tunisia decided to be loyal to His Majesty the King. Talleyrand first he retorted righteously and then put on a business-like expression. Let's go back to the merchant ship. You should know very well that the oarsmen who board the ship from Mitiga will exhaust their energy by reaching Egypt at most. After that, they will either stay in Alexandria for several days or pick up new oarsmen there. Either way, the cost of transportation will increase significantly. Melka Mohammed seemed to have lost his patience. This cost is acceptable, Mr. Talleyrand. If you plan to use this as a bargaining chip, I'm afraid. Talleyrand took a deep breath of the aroma of coffee in the cup and showed an intoxicated look. You can't drink such a fragrant coffee in the Palace of Versailles. Oh, if this cup of coffee can be shipped to France within 6 days, I believe it will be great. The selling price can be as high as 1 franc. 6 days. The Grand Vizier shook his head. Emergency sailing cannot reach this speed, and that will make the cost of this cup of coffee exceed 8 francs. When people mention coffee, most people think of the coffee culture in Europe and subconsciously think that it is the center of the coffee trade. In fact, Osman was the coffee overlord at this time. From Yemen to Ethiopia, the Ottomans produced more than a third of Europe's coffee needs. These coffees were also an important export commodity for the Ottomans less than 100 years ago. This number was 90%. It was not until Indonesia and the Americas began to plant coffee on a large scale that the Ottoman monopoly was broken. However, Yemeni coffee can still stand out among the others in terms of quality and price. The emergency voyage mentioned by Malcolm Mohammed refers to letting the ship pass through the Mediterranean at the fastest speed regardless of the life or death of the oarsman. This is usually only used to convey urgent messages, and if used in the commercial field, the cost will be an acceptably high. Just like the 8 franc coffee he just mentioned. The price in the Ottoman Levant port will not exceed 2 sous. The rest is the cost of the rower. Talleyrand shook his coffee cup contentedly and said with a smile, what if my merchant ship can maintain a speed of more than 8 knots without using oarsmen? How is this possible? Malika Mohammed said nonchalantly. Sail alone cannot reach such a fast speed. Yes. However, we can rely on coal. Britain's steamship has begun production, and it only takes 6 days to arrive here from France. Talleyrand looked at him. His tone was quite proud. He laughed. The cost is only slightly higher than that of an ordinary galley. Oh, and if the British ship supplies in Algiers, the cost is even higher than that of a steamship. Yes, the main arena for steam paddle steamers was river navigation, but they were perfectly fine in the calm Mediterranean too. Of course, there are currently only a few coal mines in Tunisia along the Mediterranean coast, so it is very difficult to add coal along the way. Merchant ships were able to carry large amounts of coal on voyages, resulting in lower cargo volumes, but this did not prevent Talleyrand from impressing the Ottomans with bright prospects. He had previously signed an agreement with Mohammed to promote trade. When he returned to Marseille, he heard the news that the Brest shipyard had begun producing steam paddle steamers, and he immediately realized that this could be used to renegotiate trade with the Ottomans. However, the main reason for his eagerness to return to Constantinople. That His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had given him a diplomatic mission related to the situation in Poland. Melka Mohammed's eyes suddenly widened. Are you serious? You see, I'm the most frank person. Talleyrand gestured to the west. A steam transport ship will arrive at the port in 3 days. You can go and see for yourself. Oh, that ship only departed from Nantes when I left Marseille. It traveled through most of France, but it was only 3 days behind me. Melika Mohammed's heart suddenly stirred up a storm point. If there really is such a ship that does not require oarsmen and can maintain a high speed, it can be predicted that Mediterranean shipping will soon be monopolized by it. You know, the biggest factor restricting galleys is not the cost, but the oarsman point. Whether it is Alexandria or the Levant, a large number of merchant ships can be seen queuing up every day waiting to hire oarsmen. Of course, wealthy ship owners will buy slaves to row, but the cost is sky high, and slaves also have to rest frequently to replenish their physical strength point. So any shipper who wants to transport goods to Italy or France will definitely choose a steamship that is not restricted by any restrictions without hesitation. What's more, the speed of steamships is much faster. Ordinary galleys usually take 12 days or even half a month from Constantinople to Marseille. No wonder the lame man in front of him said confidently that France would be the largest trading partner of the Ottomans. They really can't eat a whole sheep, but in the future, the meat in their own store may have to be shipped out and sold by their ships under such a large gap in cost and efficiency. Any ban will be useless. Ottoman merchant ships would immediately hand over goods to steamships parked offshore after shipping them out of the port. Those who did not do so would lose competitiveness in front of their peers. The Grand Vizier suddenly thought of a question and raised his hand to hold Talleyrand's coffee cup. The British will not sit idly by and watch you monopolize Mediterranean shipping. Their fleet will control the entire Aegean Sea to the Gulf of Sirte. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 661 Cooperation. Talleyrand nodded with deep understanding. Yes, Your Majesty the Grand Vizier. There are always some shameless people who try to disrupt the normal trade between us through war or intimidation. He removed Melka Mohammed's hand and smiled. However, in my experience, Ivaldo's will be plagued by bad luck. Maybe their fleet will be swept away by the storm as soon as it sails through the Strait of Gibraltar. Devour, storm, in the Mediterranean. Talleyrand waved his hand. Perhaps he encountered a sea monster, who knows, but I believe that normal commercial exchanges in the Mediterranean will never be interfered with by the British. Melka Mohammed stared closely at the cripple who was talking nonsense, but she saw full confidence in his big face. With all due respect, your fleet is not a match for the British yet. You will see. Talleyrand always smiled. The arrogant British Navy will also abide by the rules of the Mediterranean. Melka Mohammed still shook his head slightly. Even if what you said comes true, our country will fall into a very unfavorable trade situation. This is not what our country wants. His concerns are well founded. Once Mediterranean shipping is monopolized by France, they can control the arrival price of goods at will, which is equivalent to controlling the lifeline of Ottoman maritime trade. Talleyrand immediately said, my dearest friend, you should not despise the friendship between our two countries. This brand new steamship is not operated by our country alone, but can be sold to you at any time. Melika Mohammed suddenly felt her breathing quicken. Are you serious? Of course, our two countries have broad space for cooperation in the future, Talleyrand said with a smile. A 32-meter steamship only costs 300,000 achak. This is a very big discount. Usually, 1 franc can be exchanged for 10 assaks, but due to the high impurities in Ottoman silver coins, it can be exchanged for up to 12 assaks. In other words, the price of a steam paddle steamer is about 25,000 francs. The cost is about 14,000 francs for such a high-tech product. This is definitely a huge discount. Joseph knew that if steamships were used to monopolize Mediterranean shipping, it would only offend the Ottomans to death. The ultimate gain was nothing more than a trade ban and unprecedented unity between Britain and Turkey. Selling the steamship to the Ottomans would firmly bring them to their side. First of all, you, Ottoman, have benefited so much from me. Why should you give me something in return in the trade agreement? Not to mention significantly lowering tariffs. At least France will be given priority in the export of important raw materials. Secondly, the Ottomans themselves would definitely not be able to repair high-tech gadgets like steamships. Later maintenance fees can easily earn back the preferential selling price. As for technology leaks, paddle steamers basically cannot be used in the military, so leaks are just leaks. By the time other countries can imitate it, France will have already made back its money and invested in the research and development of a new generation of products. Moreover, it is difficult to keep such large civilian items strictly confidential. Melka Mohammed immediately stood up and gestured to Talleyrand. This matter is of great importance. I need to report it to His Majesty the Sultan. Of course. Talleyrand looked at the coffee cup and shook his head regretfully. To be honest, I haven't had enough. The Grand Vizier was slightly startled, then slowly sat down again. You see, Talleyrand continued, there are many areas where we can cooperate if we forget about our petty differences in North Africa. Melika Mohammed nodded. I'm listening to your opinion. Talleyrand picked up his refilled coffee cup with contentment. We need to better meet each other's needs. For example, we will increase the shipment of silk, iron products, chemical products, and weapons to Constantinople and the Levant. Oh, I almost forgot. There are also steamships. The Grand Vizier immediately noticed the keyword. What weapon do you mean? Flintlock, muskets, cannons, military uniforms, surveying and mapping tools. It depends on what you want. Even blueprints can be traded. France is popularizing flintlock guns. As an outdated product, flintlock guns are best suited to be sold at a good price. The same goes for cannons using old mounts. The core of Ottoman's military weakness lies in the corrupt Janissary system, so weapons and equipment can be sold to him at will without worrying that he will become a military power. Moreover, the Ottomans would soon be needed to contain Russia in order to relieve the pressure on Poland. It is also necessary to give them some sophisticated weapons at this time. Melika Mohammed felt ecstatic in her heart. Before she could say anything, she heard Talleyrand continue, and I need more cotton and sugar cane. You should be able to satisfy my little wish. Although the Ottoman Empire was late in its life, it still had a lot of foundation for its great business. For example, Syria and Greece are important cotton producing areas, and nearly 20% of the cotton needed by the UK is imported from here. Although Egypt's sugarcane output is far less than that of the Caribbean, it is the closest producer to Europe. Melka Mohammed nodded. I will definitely suggest it to His Majesty the Sultan. Talleyrand, however, was still unfinished and said, oh, I heard that His Majesty the Sultan is training the new Topaz army. Yes, there are currently 600 soldiers, all trained according to Russian rules. He doesn't have to hide it, because this is an important reform content of Selim III, and it is impossible for the intelligence agencies of big countries not to know about this. Talleyrand looked very regretful. As we all know, a good teacher is even more important than the talent of the student. To be honest, His Majesty the Sultan's new army chose the worst teacher. Please forgive me for being so blunt. This is what General Omar Aga advised His Majesty. Talleyrand lowered his voice. General Omar Aga regarded the other party as a strong man, just because he was captured by the Russian army. Maybe it's like this. In fact, the training level of the Russian army is relatively low among major countries. The Grand Vizier heard the meaning behind his words. You mean French officers can be sent to help train Topaz? Talleyrand shook his head. No, I don't think any European country's army is suitable for training them. I know that your country's imperial guards have always been strongly opposed to training new troops, and their biggest reason is that they cannot accept pagans as instructors. This also results in Topaz being able to maintain a very small scale, otherwise it will anger all the Praetorian guards. But in the Islamic world, there are no instructors who can train them. No, there is. What do you mean? Royal Tunisian Regiment. Chapter 662 Giving and Gaining. Talleyrand saw the Ottoman Grand Vizier showing doubts, so he smiled and explained. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince asked the General Staff to recruit local residents in Tunisia and organize them into the Royal Legion. As the main defense force in North Africa, there are currently 2,500 soldiers, most of whom have the same beliefs as you. The image of Tunisian soldiers immediately appeared in Malcolm Mohammed's mind, and he hesitated. What His Majesty the Sultan needs are elites who can defeat the enemies in the north. The Ottomans had only one major enemy in the north, and that was Tsarist Russia. Talleyrand wiped the coffee stains from the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief and looked very satisfied. Please rest assured that Lieutenant Colonel Moreau is a very outstanding commander, and the Tunisian Army Corps commanded by him can be considered an elite in our country. Of course, this Tunisian standing army is slightly stronger than the old French army, but that does not prevent him from bragging. And for Osman, the French-Tunisian Legion is definitely a ceiling-like existence. Malcolm Mohammed was immediately overjoyed. Great. Can you invite 20 Tunisian instructors for Topis? I promise to pay adequate remuneration to your country. Talleyrand smiled and shook his head. This is not appropriate. The Grand Vizier was a little disappointed. Then, 10 instructors will do. Right. The cripple still shook his head. Mr. Talleyrand, you know that it is difficult to ensure the level of training if there are too few instructors. You misunderstood. Talleyrand waved his hand. What I mean is that if the new army trains in Constantinople, it will inevitably be affected by the previous environment. Let them go to Tunisia and train with our soldiers, so as to achieve the best results. He blinked mysteriously again. Furthermore, being separated by more than half of the Mediterranean Sea, it is impossible for those in the Imperial Guard to know the specific number of Topises. Also, the soldiers' salaries can be paid to our country first in the name of consulting fees, and then our country will transfer them to the officers in Topis. In this way, the guards cannot estimate the size of the new army through audits. Malika Mohammed's eyes suddenly lit up. This is indeed a good way to get rid of the constraints of the Praetorian Guards. If we can really train 10,000 Topises behind their backs. No, even if there are only 5,000 people, when this new army returns to Constantinople, it will be able to completely suppress the power of the guards. He is very clear about the combat effectiveness of his Yarachini Forbidden Army. At Topis's current level, 1,000 soldiers can defeat 5,000 Forbidden Army. Not to mention the Topiges trained by the French army. 5,000 people are enough to firmly control the entire capital. At the same time, Tunisia is an Islamic environment, and there is basically no need to worry that the new army will be badly influenced by Europe. It's a perfect plan. If the empire's financial resources can sustain it, it is not impossible to train 50,000 Topis in Tunisia, defeat Russia, and retake Crimea. Of course, this is just wishful thinking on his part. Joseph would definitely not allow Osman to cultivate such a strong army. At most, 4 to 5,000 new troops would be enough. After all, he is going to dig the Suez Canal in the future. Don't wait until you go. The Ottoman new army will first eliminate the Mamluks and then regain the entire Egypt, which will be great fun. Malcolm Mohammed's smile suddenly froze. As the Grand Treasurer of the Empire, after experiencing a short period of joy, he immediately thought that, if he did it in the way Talleyrand said, it would be equivalent to the Empire recognizing that Tunisia belonged to France. He sighed bitterly. On this matter, His Majesty the Sultan still needs to make a decision. Talleyrand did not wait long. He was summoned by the Ottoman Sultan at noon the next day. In the extremely spacious vaulted hall of Topkapi Palace, Selim III leaned on the soft floor and gestured to the eunuchs beside him. Immediately, a beautiful half-dressed slave girl placed a cup of fragrant coffee in front of the French foreign minister. The latter smiled and nodded to the Sultan. Thank you very much, Your Majesty. I heard that you like the coffee here very much. Selim III gestured to the coffee cup. This has just been shipped from Mocha. I hope you like it. Talleyrand picked up the coffee, blew on it, took a sip, and exaggeratedly praised. This is absolutely the best drink I've ever had. You've made me even more obsessed with Constantinople. Selim III raised his index finger and waved at the eunuch. Send a ship of royal coffee to my friend to the port of Marseille. As you command, my greatest master. Talleyrand smiled broadly and was about to say thanks when he saw Selim III looking at him and saying, "My friend, I have learned from the Grand Vizier your sincerity. Now, I hope to hear from you the real purpose of your visit to Constantinople this time." Talleyrand immediately said enthusiastically, "Of course, promoting French-Turkish trade can make it more prosperous." The young Sudan just looked at him with a smile. Talleyrand said in his heart that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was indeed right. The current man in Topkapi Palace was much more difficult to deal with than his predecessor. He pushed the coffee cup away, stood up, stroked his chest and saluted. "Your eyes can see everything, Your Majesty. I'm listening." "England. My goal is England. Please sit down and talk." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Talleyrand bowed and said, "You know, our country is in fierce competition with Britain. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince hopes to exchange some of the things you need for Syrian cotton and Egyptian sugarcane. Oh, the Franco-Turkish trade must be extremely important." Selim III nodded slightly. He was naturally aware of the fierce competition between Britain and France in the textile industry. Although the cotton production in his hands was not much, it was enough to influence the balance. Last week, he just received news from the Caribbean that blacks were rioting, which means that there will be a serious shortage of sugar this year. Egyptian sugarcane will become a strategic resource. He pondered for a few seconds, twisted the tasbih beads in his hand, and said, "Our country controls no less than 40% of the number of steamships entering the port, a foundry capable of manufacturing 32-pound cannons, and provides 2,000 sets of French standard equipment for topizers training in Tunisia, and you, my friend, will have the priority purchase right of 60% of the goods produced in Syria and Egypt." Talleyrand felt relieved. It seemed that he had been fooled. But to be honest, he only knew that His Royal Highness wanted to link the situation in Egypt and Poland, but he was not sure about the deeper strategic goal. Then he smiled again. The Sultan's words just now had already shown that the Ottomans were going to recognize France's claim to Tunisia. Chapter 663 From Egypt to Poland. Of course, France's control over Tunisia is an established fact, but the recognition from the Ottoman Empire is equivalent to eliminating the last hidden danger for this matter from now on. Tunisia is France's indisputable inherent territory. Talleyrand bargained again and finally raised the priority purchase ratio to 70%, and agreed on a series of preferential trade terms so far. The trend of the Ottoman Empire turning to Britain has been officially reversed. Selim III then invited Talleyrand to attend the banquet. Google searched awaken when the two of them, surrounded by a group of officials, walked around the huge swimming pool in the palace. Talleyrand suddenly said worriedly, "Your Majesty, I'm a little worried whether Egypt can fully implement your will." After a long series of preparations, this is the highlight of his trip. Selim frowned slightly, and although he was not confident enough, he still waved his hand proudly. "Please rest assured, they dare not go against my will, otherwise they will face God's punishment." "Then I feel relieved." Talleyrand exhaled exaggeratedly, and as if he had thought of something, he moved closer to the Sultan and whispered, "Your Majesty, in fact, now is a good time for you to conquer those disobedient people." "I don't understand what you mean." "The contradictions between Murad, Ibrahim and the local beys in Egypt are getting bigger and bigger, and even the Bey alliance is hostile to each other. Even people in Paris are talking about it. If a large army is sent to eliminate the disloyal ministers now, the glory of Hassan Pasha will surely be restored." Today's Egypt is still nominally an Ottoman province, and the Sultan will also send a governor there, that is, a Pasha, but hundreds of years ago, it was the Mamluk military group that actually ruled Egypt. Especially in recent years, with the death of Hassan, a fierce Ottoman general, he had led his army to defeat the Mamluk army in a local battle, and recovered the taxes owed by the latter to the empire. The Mamluks have completely controlled Egypt and began to proclaim themselves Pashas. The Pashas sent by the Ottomans to Egypt were restricted to the vicinity of their residences and were closely protected by Mamluk guards when they entered and left. However, the Mamluk group also declined from its peak, and internal strife began to occur. The central and local military leaders fought against each other, and there were constant conflicts between the clergy group and the Mamluks. Historically, it was during the Mamluk civil strife that Napoleon led his army to defeat them in one fell swoop and gain control of Egypt. Salam III glanced at the French and said meaningfully, the beasts in the north are eyeing the empire. As long as our army goes to Egypt, they will immediately howl and go south to tear a piece of meat from the empire. What he did not mention was that Austria was also thinking about the Ottoman territory from Wallachia to Bulgaria. This is also the reason why the Ottomans never dared to solve the Egyptian problem. Historically, it was not until the emperor defeated the Mamluks and withdrew to France under the pressure of the British Navy that the Ottomans took the opportunity to recover the empty Egypt. Joseph would naturally not follow the old path of the emperor making wedding clothes for others, but instigated the Ottomans to consume the Mamluks first, and then pick peaches. When he chose the opportunity. Talleyrand deliberately quickened his pace, distanced himself from the Ottoman officials beside him, and whispered to the Sultan, I have an important intelligence to give you. Russia will not have time to look south for quite a long time, at least a year. Selim III's eyes flashed with surprise, but he returned to normal in an instant. How do you know what Russia will do? Talleyrand didn't know how the intelligence department got such important news, but His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was very sure that Russia would attack Poland, and that would definitely not be wrong. He said with great confidence, Your Majesty, this is reliable information obtained by our intelligence personnel from the Winter Palace. Within half a year to a year, Russia will fully invade Poland, but I can assure you that they will be in a tough battle. Selim III immediately turned his head and stared at Talleyrand closely. The latter continued, if you don't believe it, you can send someone to investigate Russia's troop movements and material reserves around Poland. Selim III turned around, and a middle-aged eunuch with fair skin hurried over and whispered to him. The Sultan looked at Talleyrand again, nodded to confirm his information, but still said calmly, even if your prediction comes true, it is still too risky for the empire to attack Egypt rashly. Yes, Your Majesty. Talleyrand nodded. It is indeed risky to conquer the Mamluks with the current imperial army, but what if we add 2,000 new toppages? Selim III couldn't help but pause. Talleyrand added, a full set of French equipment. Selim III's eyes flashed with an unconcealable excitement, and he said in a deep voice, what if Poland is defeated by the Russians before the empire takes back Egypt? Talleyrand was secretly happy, and he didn't expect the Sultan to say what he was going to say. He immediately said seriously, Your Majesty, so you must provide Poland with as much help as possible to resist the Russian attack. That's impossible. Selim III said without hesitation, I can't declare war on Russia for Poland. Well, Russia is giving face by not coming to beat the Ottomans. How dare the Ottomans take the initiative to provoke? Talleyrand smiled and shook his head. Your Majesty, you misunderstood. You know that Poland is a poor country. You only need to provide them with some logistical supplies to greatly enhance their combat effectiveness. The Sultan frowned and spoke with some difficulty. The empire is no longer bordering Poland. How can the supplies be sent there? In the early days, Turkey and Poland were bordering each other, but the Treaty of Jassy ceded Crimea to Russia. Since then, the two countries have been separated by Ochakov. Talleyrand said, you send people to transport the supplies to the mouth of the Dnieper River through the Black Sea, and then the Crimean Resistance Organization will go north along the Dnieper River into Poland. To be honest, he himself thought this plan was a bit strange, but His Royal Highness the Crown Prince asked him to convince the Sultan. After a while, Selim III said, after the banquet, please tell me the details in detail. South bank of the Seine River, a strange ship painted white with only two slender masts installed at the bow and stern, and a thick chimney standing in the middle of the deck, was floating quietly on the water on the wooden platform next to the dock, under the gaze of hundreds of nobles and reporters. Joseph threw a bottle of wine tied to a long rope to the steamship behind him. With a pop, the wine scattered, and cheerful music and warm applause suddenly sounded around. Joseph turned around and announced loudly, the Palace Cafe officially set sail. May its coal always be sufficient. Chapter 664 Speed Race. The chimney of the Palace Cafe, the world's first steam paddle steamer put into practical use, spewed out inky black smoke. Then, the hull trembled slightly. The huge wooden wheel on the side gradually accelerated its rotation, knocking in the Seine, making a rhythmic par sound. This ship is very different from Joffre's original design. The hull lines are more reasonable to increase stability and reduce resistance. The boiler and transmission system have been greatly optimized, increasing the effective power by as much as 20%. The internal structures such as the cargo hold and the cockpit are no longer as sloppy as before. While ensuring strength, the space is used to the extreme point. No matter how talented the civilian designers are, they are far inferior to the design capabilities of the military industry system under the blessing of the state machine. What the latter needs is just a flash of inspiration from the former. After having inspiration, they can quickly bring you extremely refined industrial products. The Palace circled the river, showing its elegant figure, and then docked at the pier again. Joseph and more than a dozen followers boarded the ship along the gangway. Behind him, more nobles followed the Palace excitedly and curiously. Yes, Joseph, who knew the importance of publicity, how could he miss this rare opportunity of the first voyage of the steamship? The wine is fragrant, and the whole world must know it as soon as possible, and then people will rush to give money. Not long after, the paddle wheel of the Palace turned again, and amid the cheers of the onlookers, it came to a very long banner in the center of the river. There were already 17 or 18 ships moored here, of different sizes, including paddle boats and pure rowing boats, and the words on the banner, that was half the width of the river, were, "The first Seine River Freight Ship Race." The prize money for this competition held by the Palace of Versailles was as high as 30,000 francs, attracting almost all ship owners in France to participate. Of course, most of the ships were eliminated in the previous qualifying rounds, and those who could appear here were basically well-known strongmen in the shipping industry. Hundreds of reporters from various countries came. They hired a large number of horse-drawn carriages and gathered on the shore, ready to follow the whole process. Speaking of which, ships of this era, even steamships, were not as fast as horses. On the front deck of the Palace, Joseph raised his pistol and pulled the trigger. The loud bang echoed on the river. All the participating ship owners were so excited that their eyes were red, and they shouted to command the crew to drive the boat forward. Each ship carried 20 tons of cargo and more than 50 passengers, and the ship that arrived at the port of Le Havre first and returned to Paris would win a prize of 30,000 francs. 5 or 6 smaller paddle boats left in a dusty dust, leaving all opponents behind, and soon disappeared. On the Palace, Joseph looked at the various garbage floating on both sides of the ship and resisted the urge to cover his nose. After all, there were many nobles and reporters around. Although the sanitation of the Seine has been greatly improved after the continuous governance of the beautiful Paris movement in the past few years, the smell is still very irritating when you are on the water. Well, in fact, until the 21st century, this problem has not been completely solved. Joseph took the perfumed handkerchief from Camellia, covered his mouth and nose, and kept muttering in his heart, "After this game is over, the European inland shipping market will be dominated by steam paddle steamers. And the fine for dumping excrement into the Seine will be doubled." Until leaving Paris, a large number of people stood on both sides of the Seine to watch and waved and cheered. This game has opened the odds. The silver reel with the highest odds has an odds of 1 to 15, and the Palace has an odds of 1 to 3.5, which is not low. In fact, almost no one bet on the Palace to win. So Joseph estimated that this competition would not only save money, but also make a profit of hundreds of thousands. The stench on the river surface finally faded. Joseph looked around with a telescope, and the Palace was basically in the middle. It is estimated that some reporters have started to write a press release that steamboats are useless. However, before the participating ships sailed to Vernon, a small town more than 70 kilometers away from Paris, the ships in the front began to slow down. These small boats were able to lead by rowing desperately. At this time, the rowers were almost exhausted. And several larger paddle boats, together with the Palace, surpassed them and became the first echelon. After another 4 hours, the steam paddle steamer still maintained a speed of 8.5 knots without emotion, leaving all opponents behind. Only 3 galleys, the Treasure in the Mountain and the 7 Birds, managed to catch up after entering Normandy. Replacing all the rowers at all costs, Camelia ran back and forth between the deck and the captain's room very diligently, informing the crown prince of the latest status of the ship, and occasionally went to the second cabin to bring coffee to poor Perna and comfort her for a while. Well, Perna also came, still severely seasick. She didn't know herself. Maybe she subconsciously expected to get the crown prince's careful care like the time she went to North Africa the year before. At 6 p.m. the philosophy passed round, and no other participating ships could be seen on the river. Not surprising at all. In the absence of wind, steam-powered ships are almost invincible. Joseph, surrounded by a group of nobles, went to the restaurant on the ship to prepare for the dinner. The maid was busy going to the kitchen to confirm the dishes. If the chef on the ship was not good enough, she would have to cook it herself. The first task given to her by Her Majesty the Queen was to take care of the diet of the Crown Prince. What she didn't know was that at this moment, in the corner of the cabin, a pair of resentful eyes were staring at her. If Camelia saw the face under the pink wide-brimmed hat, she might remember that this person's name was Anne-Marie Harriet, the noble lady who had bid with her for the true love ticket in Notre Dame de Paris. Damn Austrian bitch. Harriet stared at her and gritted his teeth. She used to be very conceited. She was born in the Palace of Versailles. She was outstanding in appearance. Her family was a count who had been passed down for more than 200 years. Her father was very rich. In the past, everyone around her would flatter her, praise her, and greet her with a smile. However, the Austrian bitch humiliated her severely in Notre Dame de Paris. But that bitch was much prettier than her, richer than her family, and able to serve the crown prince. That day, after returning from Notre Dame, she was overwhelmed by jealousy and resentment, and even her personality became gloomy. And today, she used a lot of connections, and spent a huge amount of money, to finally get the opportunity to be on the same ship with His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. But she saw that woman again. She felt her chest spasm. Chapter 665 Camelia's Crisis. And Mary, dear, what are you looking at? A soft voice suddenly appeared from behind Harriet, and she turned around suddenly in fright. She saw a charming girl wearing an emerald green lace dress, with high bun, and a pair of fox eyes. Smiling at yourself. Ah, Veronique, it's you. Harriet blinked his eyes subconsciously, and forced himself to calm down. You didn't hear anything, did you? No. Veronique Legris smiled and shook her head. What's wrong? Did I miss something? No, 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 no. Harriet breathed a sigh of relief. Why? Didn't you go to the dinner party? Miss Legris said, raising her eyes inadvertently and catching a glimpse of Camelia's back. She narrowed her eyes slightly, then immediately changed her expression to a concerned expression, took Harriet's arm, and whispered, my dear, out of the responsibility of a friend, I have to remind you that it is best to avoid that woman as much as possible in the future. Harriet immediately turned his head and said in disbelief, what are you talking about? Legris sighed. You have to face reality, my dear. Look at her charming face and graceful waist. No man can resist it, including, ahem, His Highness. And she also got Perna, Mrs. Protection. Alas, I know that woman may have treated you harshly, but you really can't afford to offend her. Nobles love to spread gossip, so almost everyone in the Palace of Versailles knew about the incident of snatching the true love charm from Notre Dame Cathedral. Harriet looked like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. With his hands on his hips, his face red, and his voice became sharp. Why? She is just a lowly Moravian. I'm the noble Frank Noble. She should be the one to avoid me. I'm not afraid of her. Let her come. Let's see who can fight who. Oh, dear, I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing. Don't be angry. Miss Legris seemed to be frightened, her eyes slightly lowered, and she said tremblingly, she is indeed just a vulgar person in front of you. A country woman, but she can use her looks and skills to get you into trouble, just like that time at Notre Dame. Harriet was already trembling slightly with excitement. This is Paris. The Palace of Versailles belongs to us. She is not allowed to run wild. Legris hurriedly pulled her arm and said worriedly, don't do this. If you provoke her, you will only get hurt. I'm really worried about you. She glanced at Harriet's expression and continued to comfort her. Well, it would be great if she died. If you ask me, God had better punish her by falling into the water and drowning, and go to hell as soon as possible. Otherwise you may not have an easy life in Versailles. Shut up. He shouted regardless of etiquette, shook off his best friend's hand, picked up her skirt, and ran out of the cabin. The sun was setting in the west, and the breeze from the Seine River blew across Harriet's face, but she felt like a knife was stabbing herself. Just then, she heard a girl's voice coming from the stairs. "Oh, Mr. Alding, I actually forgot the yogurt sauce. It is the soul of pigeon stewed with nuts. Please send the dish to the restaurant first, and I will go back to the warehouse to get the yogurt sauce." Harriet was all too familiar with this voice. It's that Austrian bitch. Since the Palace Cafe needs to use a hot water and high temperature coal ash of the boiler, the kitchen is built separately on the side of the boiler room, and one has to pass through a section of deck to reach the warehouse in the aft cabin. Immediately, Harriet saw the black and white dress appearing not far away. She hurriedly dodged and hid behind the cockpit, and then stamped her feet in shame and anger. I'm not trying to avoid her. There was a sound of closing the door from the warehouse, and Camelia came over humming a song and holding a can of yogurt. When she passed by Harriet's hiding place, what Legris had just said suddenly appeared in the latter's mind. God had better punish her by falling into the water and drowning. Harriet felt suffocated, and his bloodshot eyes were so wide that they bulged out. She quickly scanned the deck. The crew were busy slowing down the ship at the moment, and there was no one else here. Without much thought, Harriet took off his shoes and quietly approached Camelia from behind. When the latter reached the entrance of the stairs, which was the position closest to the deck railing, she roared and slammed into it. On the bow deck of the galley, 7 birds. Sorrel leaned on the railing with a melancholy expression and whispered to the barrel in front of her, "Kind sir, can you please refund me the money you bet? There are a few poor people who are in urgent need of this." "Ah, how is this possible?" She ruffled her hair irritably. "It's been 1 day since the game started. How can the bet be refunded? But what are Mr. Hartkey and the others going to do?" "Ah, it's all my fault. It's all my fault. Not long ago, she rescued a dozen poor people from a group of slave traders. In the past, she would just give them some travel expenses and let them go home. However, most of the people trafficked this time were from the Far East, as well as 5 Indians from North America. She first treated their illnesses, and then entrusted her friends to send them back for Norah ship tickets. If they were allowed to board the ship by themselves, they would probably be robbed, or even sold again, before they passed the Cape of Good Hope. After that, she found out embarrassingly that she had no money to send the Creek tribesmen back to North America. So, she took out 3 months' salary in advance. She had been working in the intelligence agency since the end of last year, and added her remaining savings to buy the 7 birds to win the cargo ship race, a total of 400 francs. Because of the high stakes, she was qualified to board the ship to watch the competition. If the 7 birds won, she would get 880 francs, but she never expected that the smoking ship that was ridiculed by people before the race would run so fast. The captain of the 7 birds changed the oarsman for the 2nd time and ran, and the unexpected breeze on the Seine River made it difficult to see the back of the steamship again. "Everyone, work harder. After Le Havre, everyone will get a bonus of 10 francs. The captain's hysterical roar reached her ears, and the 7 birds rushed forward instantly. But Sorrel knew that the 7 birds had almost no chance of winning, and all her money was wasted. Not to mention sending Mr. Hartkey and his men back to North America. Even the food money for the second half of the month became a problem. A puff of white smoke came out of the water ahead. Sorrel looked over there curiously, but she didn't know that it was the Palace Cafe releasing steam. When the white mist dissipated, she suddenly saw 2 figures flashing on the deck of the steamer, and then one of them fell into the Seine from the side. Sorrel subconsciously grasped the hilt of the sword at her waist, and in the last bit of sunset, she saw a pink women's wide-brimmed hat with feathers. The owner of the hat didn't pay any attention to the drowning person, but turned around and went into the cabin. Sorrel was shocked and ran to the captain's room, shouting, "Mr. Ocean, someone fell into the water." The captain ran out with a group of people. "Where? Who fell into the water?" Sorrel pointed to the Palace Cafe in front of him and said anxiously, "Over there. That's the ship." Chapter 666. She pushed him precisely. Bang, bang, the continuous gunshots echoed over the Seine River, causing everyone on the Palace Café to stop what they were doing and turn to look north. Captain Bliss led his men to the deck and saw the 7 birds parked not far away. The gunshots were obviously coming from their point. A sailor stood on the main mast of the galley. He held 2 lanterns in his hands and kept posing in various postures. That was a way of communication agreed upon by the crew members who were doing transportation on the Seine River. Captain Bliss read the gestures from the other side skillfully. Someone fell into the water on the starboard side. His face froze immediately and he turned and shouted to the 3rd mate, "Quick! Starboard side, go and save people. Henry, you go and drop anchor." At this moment, the people on the Palace Café were all very important. After all, not everyone could take a boat with His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. If one of them drowned, he would never be able to sail in France again. 7 or 8 crew members jumped into the river like dumplings, and the small boat on the side was also lowered. Fortunately, there was still a trace of afterglow in the sunset, so that things could be barely seen on the water surface. Soon, a crew member pointed to a string of small bubbles and shouted, "Look there." After another half a minute, a black and white maid skirt appeared on the water, followed by long golden hair, and then Camelia's eyes were closed. A crew member tied a rope around her waist, and the people on the Palace Café dragged her onto the deck in a hurry. Joseph and the nobles also came from the restaurant. When he saw Camelia lying motionless on the deck, his heart tightened immediately. "What's going on, Your Highness?" The captain's face was pale and he stammered, "I'm very sorry." The 3rd mate pressed the maid's abdomen hard and then put his finger to her nose. He looked up in panic and looked at the captain. "No breathing." "What?" Joseph pulled him away and was about to rescue her when he saw Perna walking over weakly and waved to her. "Dr. Lamech, give her cardiopulmonary resuscitation. This kind of first aid operation is naturally safer for professionals." Perna was stunned for a moment, but immediately leaned over, lifted Camelia's neck, and then took out a bamboo tube from the medical box she carried with her, and was about to insert it into the latter's mouth. Joseph's eyes widened, and he raised his hand to block her. "What are you doing?" "Ventilate the lungs," Perna said as a matter of course. "No," Joseph said anxiously, "not CPR. Artificial respiration. Cardiopulmonary." "What? Artificial respiration?" Perna looked at the Crown Prince in confusion, at a loss like a child. Joseph held his forehead. It was over. These first aid techniques should not have been invented yet. He had to signal Perna to get out of the way, trying to recall the CPR first aid method he learned at the beginning of college, folding his hands and placing them on Camelia's soft chest. "It seems to be 30 plus 2. He pressed the maid's heart and lungs 30 times in a row, and then pinched open the bloodless little mouth. Joseph saw dozens of people around him looking at him in shock, hesitating for half a second, then took a deep breath, leaned over and covered her lips with his mouth. The girl's lips were soft and cold. Joseph didn't expect that his first kiss would be given to Camelia, but he didn't care about that at this time, and blew hard. It leaked. He frowned, slapped his forehead, pinched her upturned nose, inhaled again, blew, inhaled again, blew, and then pressed the chest 30 times. Perna realized that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince should be performing a kind of first aid. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation? Artificial respiration? She had never heard of these things. She could only clench her fists and watch from the side, and she couldn't help at all. When Joseph performed artificial respiration for the 6th time, Camelia suddenly coughed violently and sprayed a mouthful of water on his face. Then, she lay on her side, curled up, coughed and spit water continuously for a long time, and finally inhaled a breath of air with difficulty. The people around were obviously stunned for a moment, and then cheered excitedly. "Thank God. Thank the Virgin Mary, Your Highness really saved her. Ah, it's amazing." She had clearly stopped breathing just now. Behind the crowd, Miss Legris with fox eyes saw Camelia wake up. Her face suddenly darkened. She cursed secretly, and then shouted with the people next to her, "This is simply a miracle of God." Perna hurried forward to take over, roughly checked Camelia's physical condition, and asked two of Joseph's guards to put the maid on a stretcher and carry her into the cabin. After more than half an hour, Camelia finally began to regain consciousness and leaned on Perna and cried. Joseph stepped forward to help her wipe away her tears and whispered, "Are you feeling better?" Camelia nodded. "What happened? How did you fall into the water?" The girl was stunned for a moment, then spoke with difficulty. "It seems that someone pushed me." Joseph's eyes suddenly turned cold, and he looked at Xode. "Find out who did it." "Yes, your highness." Xode immediately walked out. Sorrel took a small boat and rowed slowly over from the Seven Birds and was then pulled aboard with a rope by the crew of the Paroscophe. She strode towards the cabin, and after seeing the captain, she immediately shouted, "The lady just now was pushed into the water. I saw it." Then, she saw His Royal Highness the Crown Prince walking out of a cabin and was stunned. She had been on the Seven Birds since yesterday, where she enjoyed luxurious dining services as a distinguished guest, so she had no idea that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was on another ship not far away. "Did you see the perpetrator?" Joseph asked. Sorrel quickly curtsied and saluted, nodded and said, "Yes, your highness. I saw that man wearing." At this moment, Legris suddenly squeezed out from the crowd, saluted Joseph, then pointed at Henriette and said loudly, "Your highness, I want to expose. It was she who pushed Miss Delvaux off the boat." Delvaux is Camelia's last name. Henriette, who was huddled in the corner and trembling all over, heard this and immediately collapsed to the ground, then looked at his best friend in disbelief. How did you?" Joseph winked at Kessoud, who immediately ordered his guards to control Henriette. Sorrel turned around to look at Henriette's clothes and figure and immediately nodded vigorously. Yes, it's her." Joseph looked at Legris again. "Please tell me what's going on." The latter looked extremely nervous and said, "Yes, your highness. I heard Henriette looking at Miss Delvaux's back this afternoon and cursing her and saying that it would be better if she died. I advised her not to do this and asked her to stay away from Miss Delvaux, but she pushed me away forcefully and told me to shut up fiercely. So I just thought she was the one who plotted against Miss Delvaux." At this time, another noble lady cautiously took half a step forward, curtsied, and whispered, "Your highness, I did hear someone shouting 'shut up' at the corner of the cabin." The middle-aged man next to him also echoed, "Yes, I heard it too." "No, that's not it." Henriette screamed at Legris like crazy. "It's her. It was she who told me to stay away from the Austrian bitch. So The latter immediately lowered his head and said with tears in his eyes, "Your highness, I really didn't expect Henriette to do such a thing. I should have told you earlier." Joseph waved to Kessoud with a gloomy face. "Lock her up." Chapter 667 Mission and Responsibilities. In the VIP room of the Paroscophe, after repeatedly confirming that Camelia was fine, Joseph handed her over to the more professional Perna and then walked out of the cabin quietly. The captain and others waiting at the door quickly saluted him. Sorrel stepped forward and asked, "Your highness, how is Miss Delvaux's situation?" Perna said she is out of danger. Joseph said, "Fortunately, this place is hundreds of kilometers away from Paris, and the river water is relatively clean, so there should be no infection." Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. "Ah, great, thank God." Had it not been for the warning sent by the Seven Birds, no one would have noticed that someone fell into the water. "Yeah, if I found out a few minutes later, I'm afraid it would be too late." Joseph looked at Sorrel. "Were you the first to see Camelia fall into the water?" "Yes, your highness." Sorrel nodded and then briefly described the situation at that time. Joseph bowed to her and said, "On behalf of Camelia, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you. I just did some trivial things, your highness." Sorrel said hurriedly, "In the end, it was your magical surgery that saved Miss Delvaux." Joseph waved his hand and asked again, "Are you sure that Henriette has no accomplices?" Sorrel said with certainty, "Absolutely not, your highness. Although the two ships were about half a chain length apart at the time, my eyesight was very good, and I could clearly see that they were the only two people there. One chain is 185 meters. The half chain is about 93 meters away. There are such vicious women in the world." Joseph frowned and shook his head, and suddenly thought of something. The 7 birds is so far away. How did it transmit the news that Camellia fell into the water to the Poroscope in time? He guessed that semaphore might be used, but semaphore could only convey a general meaning, such as stop, turn left and so on. And just now he heard the captain mention that the 7 birds pointed out the exact location where Camellia fell into the water. Captain Bliss hurriedly explained, "Your Highness, that is a popular communication method among us river transport people. It can express clear sentences," he said, raising his arms sideways. "You see, this represents B and this represents F." He continued to change his posture as if dancing. "Your Highness, I just said the 2 words, bless you. As long as you move fast enough, you can deliver a whole sentence to a ship several chains away in 10 seconds. When Joseph heard this, his eyes lit up. Point communication capabilities in this era were extremely poor, especially on the battlefield. After tens of thousands of troops are deployed, the distance between the left and right wings can be several kilometers. The commander issues the order, and the rider passes the order to the subordinate officers. The whole process can take as fast as 10 minutes or as slow as more than half an hour, and if the communication methods of the ship owners can be transplanted to the battlefield, and a signaling point is set up at regular intervals, it will only take 3 to 5 minutes to send the order several kilometers away. Information is a combat power multiplier on the battlefield. Point the officers on both sides discovered a key point on the battlefield at the same time. I mobilized the nearest soldiers through efficient communication methods, and may have already occupied the place. The cavalrymen who sent orders from the other side were still on the waypoint. The more Joseph thought about it, the more he felt that this technology had unlimited prospects. He immediately patted Captain Bliss on the arm. "You may receive a special bonus from the General Staff soon." Joseph wrote down the idea of ship owner communication mode and looked at Sorrel. "By the way, why are you on the 7 birds?" "Because I'm a distinguished guest on the ship." "Did you buy a boat ticket?" Sorrel's pretty face suddenly turned red, and she muttered, I bought the boat for 400 francs and won. The VIP ticket is included." Joseph sighed. "Your gambling luck seems to be not very good. That ship can't win. Let's do this. I'll give you 400 francs for the winning bet on the Poroscope." "Oh, I bought this myself as a reward for rescuing Camellia. This is..." Sorrel struggled for a while, and finally knelt down and said, "Thank you, Your Highness. I really need this money urgently, to help Mr. Hartkey return to the tribe." "Oh, as soon as I receive my salary, I will. The money is returned to you. This is my opinion. You don't have to be polite." Joseph smiled and shook his head, then asked curiously, "Who is Mr. Hartkey?" "He is an Indian from the Creek tribe, Your Highness. He and 4 companions fell into the hands of slave traders in England. I accidentally rescued them, and now I want to send them back to North America." Joseph couldn't help but praise, "You are such a kind and good-hearted person." The next day at dusk point the Poroscope arrived at the port of Le Havre first, and dropped anchor to prepare for the night. It has thrown away the nearest 7 birds by more than 20 kilometers without navigational equipment in this era. Sailing after dark was impossible. Point in Camellia's cabin. The shaking of the ship's hull woke Perna, who was lying next to the maid's bed, from her sleep. Point she sat up straight, looked around, and found that the boat had stopped, and she felt relieved. Point after her short sleep and the fact that the ship was no longer rocking. Apart from being slightly dizzy, she no longer had seasickness symptoms such as nausea. Point Perna looked at Camellia, who was still sleeping soundly, and stepped forward to caress her forehead. The fever had completely subsided. Point then, she pressed her wrist and counted her pulse silently for a while, then nodded slightly. "The recovery is pretty good." She put Camellia's hand back under the quilt and inadvertently glanced at the latter's already bloody lips, and her mind immediately recalled the kiss that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had leaned over during the day. Point Perna's face instantly turned red, and she shook her head nervously and shyly. "Your Highness was just rescuing." She suddenly felt a little sour in her heart. If His Highness's kiss was for her, what am I thinking about? She glanced at the maid again in panic, turned around, opened the door, lowered her head and walked out, as if she was afraid that the sleeping camellia would hear her thoughts. However, when Perna closed the door gently, she found that yesterday's scene kept lingering in her mind and she couldn't stop it. No, His Highness is performing artificial respiration. She said to herself seriously, that is superb medical technology, not a kiss. No, wait. She was suddenly startled and murmured in a low voice, such a superb medical technology, if it can be promoted, it will definitely save more lives. As a doctor, I haven't mastered this technology at all, so how can I use it to save patients? Yes, this is my mission and responsibility as a doctor. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 668 Attachment. Bang bang. There was a knock on the door, and Joseph, who had already changed into his pajamas, frowned slightly and heard the girl's voice. Your Highness, I have something to ask you. It was Perna's voice. Monks had already consciously become invisible when she appeared at the cabin stairway point. Joseph looked at his pajamas, picked up the cavalry uniform, and put it on, and said to the door, please come in. His attire is actually rude, but this is not the Palace of Versailles, so there are not so many strict requirements. The door opened, and Perna, dressed in a neat white uniform, walked in with her head lowered. She bowed quickly and said with some stumble, Your Majesty, that I want to know something about. She straightened her back and spoke louder. The method you used to treat camellia yesterday was, called cardiopulmonary resuscitation and artificial respiration, right? Joseph nodded. Yes, they are actually part of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. In addition to rescuing drowning victims, they can also deal with situations such as cardiac arrest and shock. Its main principle is through. Perna suddenly said, Your Highness, can you teach me CPR? I mean, as a doctor, I hope to. Of course. Joseph nodded. He had taught Perna medical skills before, so he immediately raised his hand and gestured. Well, you must first remember the formula for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is 120 plus 30 plus 2. This means that when performing heart compressions, 120 times per minute should be used with force. After 30 compressions, perform 2 artificial respirations. Perna learned very seriously. Cross your hands. Place them 2 fingers upward from the end of the ribs, and press down. Well, you have to pay attention to the rhythm. Is that so, Your Highness? Joseph looked at her movements and shook his head slightly. The angle is wrong. You have to put your body weight on it. Oh, you'd better practice it actually. He wanted to call them in, but Perna had already walked over, put her hand on his chest, and asked, Is this here? Joseph nodded, simply pulled the mattress to the ground, then lay down, and warned, This is practice now, you have to be gentle, don't break my ribs. Perna was amused and felt less nervous than before. She began to kneel beside the crown prince, and practice cardiopulmonary compressions. Oh, that's right, that's it. Joseph endured the pain and nodded. You learn very quickly. After 30 compressions like this, blow air into the patient's lungs. Like this. Inhale. Hold the nose with one hand and the mouth with the other hand. Cover the patient's mouth completely and blow hard. He said, getting ready to stand up. You can ask your friends to practice this. Before he finished speaking, he saw Perna's delicate hands appearing in front of him. 2 green fingers pinched his nose, and the other hand opened his mouth. Then, her soft and tender lips pressed against his mouth. Cool. The gas with the fragrance of a girl poured into Joseph's mouth. Not very hard, but very gentle, with a touch of shyness. This, just as Joseph was about to say something, Perna raised her head and took a deep breath. She leaned over again without hesitation and placed her red lips on his mouth again. Joseph's heart accelerated suddenly and he felt blood rushing to his head. After a moment, the warm lips slowly left and Joseph suddenly felt a little reluctant to leave. Perna's cheeks were already flushed and she leaned back, but her green eyes did not move away from the crown prince's face. Joseph hurriedly said, well, you did a good job. Very standard. Then, From now on you will, Perna suddenly said, Your Highness, I'm so happy. Actually, throughout the whole day, I have been thinking about it all the time. If only I was the person who fell into the water yesterday. Perna's eyes became extremely firm. Her fingers pinched the pocket of her white coat, and she said, although I know that I'm from a humble background, I still can't help but fall in love with you. Ever since that day, when you suddenly appeared in the kitchen, I have fallen deeply in love with you, and I can't help myself anymore. Please, let me finish. Perna's voice was soft but clear. I don't ask for anything. I just hope to be by your side forever. Especially at that moment just now, I felt like my soul was melting, and I prayed to God in my heart to make that moment become eternity. I don't know what I'm talking about. My heart is beating very fast. In short, Your Highness, I beg you, let me see you forever, until the day God calls me away. Joseph felt that his heart seemed to be a little warm. Maybe it was just an illusion, and then memories emerged involuntarily. The girl in front of her carefully checked herself and asked softly about her health. She would appear in front of him almost every day, whether it was a arduous journey or a smoke-filled battlefield. She would be by his side silently. Even though she was severely seasick, she followed him out to sea without hesitation. I seem to have become accustomed to her presence everywhere in my life. He looked at the girl and said softly, Perna, thank you very much. Perna's eyes were red, but she smiled sweetly. She suddenly rushed over and put her arms around Joseph's neck, then closed her beautiful emerald eyes and moved forward bravely and slowly with her red lips. Then, the warm and tender touch came from Joseph's mouth. It was not artificial respiration, but a gentle suction, and trembling slightly, he stayed there, as if he didn't know what to do. Joseph felt that he was wrapped in boundless tenderness. He subconsciously reached out to hug the gentle body tightly, tilted his head slightly, and kissed back hard. The girl seemed a little nervous. The prince's kiss was more passionate and lingering than hers. Then, she felt that her consciousness was melted by flames, and only the prince's handsome face was left in her mind. Perna hugged Joseph tightly, like a koala hanging on a thick eucalyptus tree, and whispered in his ear, Your Highness, I love you, just like leaves looking forward to falling into the arms of the earth. The clouds above the Palace gently parted the night and caught up with the bright moon in the sky. The hazy moonlight sprinkled on the river, as if covering the Seine with a layer of white silk. The Palace stopped on the river, and under the moonlight, it was as quiet and elegant as an oil painting. When the morning light shone on the Palace again, this brand new steamship seemed to exude a mature atmosphere completely different from the past. It sounded the whistle and slowly sailed out of the harbor with a vision of the future. Chapter 669 The Strangeness of the Holy See. In the Crown Prince's cabin, Perna sat behind the exquisite wooden table, eating breakfast in small bites, but from time to time she secretly glanced at Joseph opposite, and her cheeks suddenly turned red. Her eyes were filled with a happy smile, and she quickly lowered her head again, pretending to be concentrating on the food on the plate. She didn't do a routine checkup on His Royal Highness the Crown Prince today. She did a full body checkup last night, and everything was very normal. Even, it's a little too normal. Just as her thoughts were wandering, Emin knocked on the door with a dinner plate in hand, placed 2 pieces of fried fish steak and toast in front of the Crown Prince and her respectively, and bowed to signal. The waiter's expression was calm, as if the scene in front of him was just an ordinary day. A maid walked around from behind him and walked along the corner towards the inner room of the cabin. Perna was stunned for a moment, then suddenly jumped up, as if she had been electrocuted. She stepped forward to block the maid, and showed an awkward smile. Well, Diana, wait, I will clean up the room later. Well, the space on the boat is limited, and the bed is very narrow, so last night's bedding is still on the floor. Maybe some traces are on it too. If the maid saw this, she would die of shame. In the past few years, Joseph had become accustomed to others making his bed and folding his quilt. At this time, he also reacted and coughed dryly. Diana, you don't have to worry about it. Yes, Your Highness. Joseph looked at the extremely shy Perna again. The two of them smiled tacitly at the same time. Joseph signaled Emin to go out as well, pressed Perna on the chair next to the dining table, and said softly, You have breakfast first. You will faint after the boat sails, and I'm afraid you will lose your appetite. But, in the room, just leave it to me. Perna looked at Joseph's busy figure, and a deep sweetness suddenly filled her heart. With black smoke rising from the chimney, the Peroskophe resumed its racing journey, but the Dauphin's cabin was never tidied up. 2 days later the steamship returned to Paris first, leaving the second place 7 birds more than 90 kilometers away. The entire inland shipping industry was immediately shaken. Hundreds of reporters quickly sent countless reports about the game back to China. Camellia is still a little weak, and has had a low fever since yesterday morning. This made Perna very anxious, and she directed the royal doctor who came to greet her to carry her into the carriage. An Emery Hewitt was taken away directly by the palace guards. What happened on the ship had already been reported back to Versailles by land. Count Hewitt, the father of the noble lady who pushed Camellia into the water, had already been waiting nervously on the pier. He waited until the crown prince finished awarding the prize to the winning boat, and then he cautiously approached. Your Highness, I swear to God, that was just an Emery's own stupid behavior, and I had no knowledge of it. He had already found out that the Austrian girl was not only the maid of the crown prince, but also the granddaughter of the queen's wet nurse. His arrogant daughter must have never understood this. Before taking action, Lord Hewitt had 7 children, 3 of whom were daughters. He never wanted to expose his family to the wrath of the royal family because of Anne-Marie. Joseph just glanced at him coldly, turned around and walked into the carriage. The judge will give a fair verdict. When Joseph returned to the Palace of Versailles, he had lunch with the king and queen whom he had not seen for many days. When he returned to the palace, he saw Talleyrand waiting for him at the door. "Ah, you back from Rome?" Joseph raised his hand to gesture to the living room and turned to Talleyrand and said, "Let's go inside and talk." The foreign minister limped along, lowered his head, and said with an annoyed expression, "Your Highness, the Pope has expressed his unwillingness to allow the Holy See to interfere in the situation in Poland." Joseph sat down on the sofa and frowned slightly. "Have you mentioned to him the matter of recasting the Catholic spear?" Talleyrand nodded. "Yes, Your Highness, I mentioned it to the Pope seriously, and he seemed to have any concerns. I mean, he was obviously interested when he first heard it, but then he refused to do it. Let's continue on this topic. Please sit down." Joseph clasped his hands and shook his head. "Such a decision by the Pope will have a certain impact on our Polish strategy." "What do you think His Majesty Pius VI is worried about?" Talleyrand hesitated and said, "Perhaps you don't want to offend the Russians." Joseph shook his head again. "Russia has no influence on the Papal States. Even if there are some trade exchanges, this benefit is nothing compared to regaining the power to be close to the Holy See in Eastern Europe. Even if Poland can defeat Russia, it will be a holy blow of the spear of God against the Orthodox heresy. This can exponentially increase the prestige of the Holy See. At this time, the Holy See was far from the glory of the Middle Ages. Although France is called Catholic dutiful son, it actually has its own independent church system, and does not accept the management of the Holy See at all. Britain, Prussia, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, and most of the German states had all converted to Protestantism. And some of the remaining Catholic spheres of influence, such as Bavaria and Salzburg, are already engaged in the Protestant Reformation. Only Spain and Austria are the last reservations of the Holy See. Therefore, Poland, which recently established a constitution that stipulated Catholicism as a state religion, has become a rare performance growth point for the Holy See over the years. Joseph originally wanted to use this to gain Poland the support of the Holy See. Although the control of the Holy See has declined, it is still the legitimate spokesperson of God in the hearts of tens of millions of believers in Europe. If the Holy See can make a call for Poland to resist the Orthodox heresy, not to mention that it will encourage Catholics from all over the world to go to Poland to participate in the Holy War, it will at least greatly boost the morale of the Polish people. The mentality of simply resisting aggression and resisting aggression in accordance with God's will are completely different. This was also one of Joseph's Polish strategies. Unexpectedly, Pope Pius VI refused. So, why did the Pope put aside the huge benefits? Joseph caressed the armrest of the sofa, lost in thought. "There are greater benefits," Talleyrand continued. Perhaps he is facing threats that force him to give up his interests. Joseph looked at him and said, "You are right. Among the countries related to the situation in Poland, Russia is a heretic and Prussia is a Protestant. Only Austria can have anything to do with the Holy See," Talleyrand said in surprise, "but Austria adheres to the national policy of safeguarding Poland, so it shouldn't." Joseph narrowed his eyes. "No, I think it's probably Austria." He knew very well that Austria had never shown mercy when it invaded Polish territory in history. If the Papal States gave up their support for Poland because of Austria, then it all makes sense. The Papal States almost have territorial disputes with neighboring Italian countries. This is not the era of Pepin. Although Sardinia, Tuscany, and the two Sicilies are all Catholic countries, they also firmly demand that the Pope return their respective territories. Chapter 670. Isn't it just going to hell? Of course, currently, the Italian countries can only pay lip service due to their lack of strength. But if Austria, which has huge influence in Italy, gives secret support, they really dare to bite a piece of flesh from the Papal State. Your Highness, why does Austria want to prevent the Holy See from supporting Poland? Joseph said without hesitation, Austria is also going to attack Poland. Facing Talleyrand's surprised gaze, he told Demon, who was standing at the door, "Please let Mr. Fouche come to see me." "Yes, Your Highness." Joseph frowned and said, "Poland must immediately strengthen its defenses in the southwest." Talleyrand said with some worry, "Your Highness, the current relationship between Bo and Austria is very close, and they may not take it seriously, and it also conflicts with the planned battle plan." Joseph sighed, "It seems that we are the only one to help them defend. At least we have to block the first wave of the Austrian offensive." "You mean we send troops directly?" "No, that will put us into a diplomatic crisis." Joseph shook his head and looked at the map on the table. "We can own 40% of the shares of the Tarnowsk Mountain silver mine. It's none of our business if tough miners get armed to protect the mines." He looked at Talleyrand again and said, "So, what's the situation on the Ottoman side?" Talleyrand seemed relieved. Selim III has agreed to provide logistical support to the Black Sea. In terms of trade, he asked for control of 40% of the steam transport ships, for us to assist in building a gun foundry, and to provide 2,000 sets of infantry equipment in exchange for 70% of the first right to purchase cotton and sugar cane. "You did a very good job." Joseph nodded with satisfaction. "This way our Polish strategy can be strongly supported. If the Ottomans refused to support Poland, Joseph would have no choice but to use the smuggling ships of the Special Trade Association to purchase supplies from the Levant and transport them to the north coast of the Black Sea. Not only is this extremely expensive, but the transportation volume will certainly not be too large. If Osman supplies supplies nearby, it will be twice the result with half the effort. More importantly, the Ottomans had many merchant ships in the Black Sea, and could easily hide the presence of supply fleets." While the two were talking, Eamon lightly knocked on the door and said, "Your Highness, Viscount Carlona and Mr. Mesmer are back." Talleyrand had already finished reporting his work, and after hearing this, he stood up and left. After a while, the liar duo walked in under the leadership of Eamon. The two of them hurriedly saluted respectfully, and then hurled all kinds of disgusting compliments at the Crown Prince for free. Joseph skillfully raised his hand to interrupt them, and then looked at Colonna. "Viscount Colonna, have all the British funds been properly handled?" The latter bowed as if taking credit and said, "Don't worry, every penny has returned to France, and I swear, absolutely no one can trace the whereabouts of these money." For the entire London gas street lighting project, he and Mesmer cooperated and obtained a total of £1.04 million of investment. But after this huge sum of money was remitted from the UK, it was easily detected that it had flowed into France. As a professional who had served as finance minister, Colonna was sent by Joseph to handle the money. In the end, he did live up to his trust and allowed all funds to flow safely into France through various investments, loans, share operations and other means. He had been dealing with this matter for more than half a year before, and he had just returned to France. "You did a great job." Joseph praised him, and suddenly remembered the previous things about the Holy See, and couldn't help but narrowed his eyes. All he wanted was for the Holy See to issue a call for a holy war against heretics. Since Pius VI was unwilling to contribute, he could help him make the call point. As long as the morale of the Poles can be inflamed, what is the difference between the true Holy See and the false Holy See? He looked at Mesmer. It just so happens that I have a talent here who is very good at fake point. Joseph quickly planned it in his mind to confirm that this method was feasible, so he took out a pardon letter from the drawer and handed it to Mesmer. You provided a lot of help to Viscount Colonna in London. It's time for me to fulfill my promise. This is your pardon and you won't have to go to jail again. Mesmer hurriedly took the pardon letter, unfolded it, and saw the signature and seal of Louis XVI on it. His eyes turned red with excitement, and he bowed vigorously to Joseph. Thank you, Your Highness. Your most loyal servant will remember it throughout his life. Your kindness. Oh, and His Majesty the King, whose kindness is as. Joseph had no choice but to raise his hand to interrupt him again, and said with a smile, if I remember correctly, all your property has been confiscated, right? Yes, Your Highness. So, even if you are free, you still have to beg. Mesmer smiled awkwardly and said, Your Highness, I used to be a doctor, but your medical license has also been revoked. This is indeed true. Joseph nodded. So, do you want to live a decent life again? Yes, of course I do. I need you to do something for me, Joseph said to the liar. After the task is completed, I will give you a new identity and 20,000 francs. You will return to the upper class society. Mesmer bowed again excitedly. Thank you for your trust, Your Highness. I'm willing to do anything for you, even if it means sacrificing my life. Joseph looked at him with a smile and said, I need you to disguise yourself as a special envoy of the Holy See and go to Eastern Europe to help me spread some Pope's decrees. The room fell silent instantly. Mesmer was clearly struggling. He dared to deceive the king and deceive the tramp, but he really did not dare to falsely convey God's will. Yes, in his view, the papal decree is the will of God. He pursed his lips and took a small step back. Your Highness, this is going to hell. Joseph kept smiling. A bonus of 30,000 francs. I will be punished by God. 40,000 francs. No, Your Highness, you can't do this. At another title. Mesmer was stunned. After a moment, he nodded with an expression as if he was on the execution ground. I will be willing to serve you. He is not pretending. People of this era really believe this. However, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince gave too much. Go to hell. Enjoy this life first. It happened that Fouche also arrived at this time. After Joseph saluted him, he pointed to Mesmer. Please select some people who are familiar with academic affairs to go to Poland with Mr. Mesmer. After explaining the task in detail, Joseph sent the two scammers away and then continued to instruct Fouche. You must send someone to confirm Austria's intention to send troops to Poland as soon as possible and closely monitor the troop movements on the Austrian-Polish border. In addition, the Ottoman cargo will arrive soon, and you and the Crimean resistance need to prepare in advance. Chapter 671 Catfish Plan. It's bound to be a busy day. Joseph saw off the intelligence chief and glanced at the already drooping sunset outside the window. Just as he was about to have dinner, Emin came quickly, leaned over and whispered, Your Highness, Mr. Styler is back. Style. Joseph was stunned for a moment before he realized. Isn't this the general manager of Lightning Company? Compared to Mesmer, who was always in the dark and used a false identity, Styler was the contractor on the surface of the London gas street lighting project, and his identity was repeatedly verified by the British. So, when the Lightning Company suffered a thunderstorm, he was immediately wanted by the British government and could only hide in the Balkans. More than half a year passed before he dared to quietly return to France to resume his life. Please invite him in quickly. Joseph nodded. Styler was the hero. In order to sabotage the London gas street lighting project, he even gave up his original family business. Styler followed Emin into the room, took off the Phrygian hat that was held low on his head, and saluted the Crown Prince with his chest. I'm really sorry to bother you so late, Your Royal Highness the Crown Prince, but there are many British spies in Paris, so I can only go out after it gets dark. Joseph gestured to the sofa. Please sit down. You have made great contributions to France, Mr. Styler. Styler hurriedly said, my name is Dittmer now, Your Highness. Thank you for your hard work. Joseph nodded with emotion. I have suggested to His Majesty the King that you be granted the title of Baron Maymac. And His Majesty has agreed. Styler's eyes widened and he quickly stood up, stroking his chest and bowing very seriously. I really don't know how to express my gratitude, Your Highness. May God bless you forever. No wonder he was so excited. This was a title, far beyond what you could buy with money. His family's class has jumped up since then. This is an honor you deserve. Joseph smiled, but you may have to stay abroad for a few years before you can use your original surname and return to Paris. He knew very well that under Britain's continental balance policy, war would inevitably break out between Britain and France. Who will care about being wanted by the British government then? Even the Lightning Company incident will be made into a joke. To discuss the British point, Styler stood up and saluted again. Thank you very much, Your Highness. In this case, I will go back to Greece and do business for a few more years, he said with a confident smile. My furniture business there has begun to take shape. When Joseph heard this, he couldn't help but feel moved in his heart. You mean Greece? Yes, Your Highness. Styler nodded. I bought synthetic boards from Marseille, then hired Collins craftsmen to process them into furniture styles that Anatolians like. Now they have been sold to the Levant. At present, Greece is Ottoman territory, separated from Constantinople by only the Aegean Sea. Joseph said, I'm planning to set up a trading company in Ottoman, and now it seems that you can be the general manager. Taylor immediately leaned forward and said, I'm willing to serve you, Your Highness. This is no ordinary company. It will have a large number of the latest steam paddle steamers, and you will try to use them to monopolize trade in the Mediterranean, even extending as far north as the Black Sea. Joseph immediately introduced him to the steamship, and then continued, in addition, you are also responsible for purchasing large quantities of cotton and sugar cane from Syria, Egypt and other places. Oh, the Ottoman Sultan has promised that our country has 70% priority in purchasing these materials. Styler smiled brightly when he heard about the steamship, but now he frowned and said, Your Highness, with all due respect, this promise is probably not very binding. Yes, even Egyptians may not obey Selim III's orders. Styler thought for a moment and nodded. Your Highness, I will try my best to buy as much of the goods you want back into the country. What are your plans? This, you know, solicitation, bribery, alliances, etc. These are the things behind business. Very good. Joseph smiled. During this process, you have to penetrate into Egypt as much as possible, especially paying attention to a senior Ottoman officer named Muhammad Ali. By the way, a war will break out there soon, so you have to prepare in advance. Yes, Your Highness, I will not disappoint you. Not long after, the new general manager of the Eastern Mediterranean Trading Company stood up and resigned. Joseph wanted to invite him to the banquet, but considering that his identity was not visible to the public, he had to give up and sent him to the gate of the Palace of Versailles. Styler bowed and backed away, and when he was about to turn around, he suddenly remembered something and stopped. Your Highness, I have always had a question. Why did you name that company Lightning? At first, he proposed several very elegant names, but the Crown Prince insisted on using the weird word lightning. Joseph smiled. Because lightning is slow. I hope London's gas street light project can be as slow as lightning. Huh? Isn't lightning supposed to be fast? No, it's slow. Why? Because lightning is a sloth. Note 1. Western Poland. Krakow, Tarnowsk Hill. In front of the office building of the Uman Silver Mining Company, which owns 80% of the silver mining rights here. The company's second manager Depu walked out of the gate quickly, got on the carriage, and rushed to the nearby town of Chibinia. Half an hour later, in a small building, where the steam engine technicians of the silver mine rested, Depu shook his head, and said to a middle-aged man dressed as a technician, Captain Ribber, ahem. The technician stopped him with a stern look. It's Mr. Ferry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Ferry. Depu nodded apologetically and continued, as you expected, the board of directors did not believe that the Austrians would attack here. Therefore, they also rejected the proposal to let the miners receive military training twice a week. Captain Ribber, who was sent by the Intelligence Bureau to be in charge of the Krakow defense plan, frowned and said, "I know, but don't worry, the operations department has already formulated a response plan for this situation." Yes, Joseph had considered before that the Poles might not be wary of the Austrians, so he also specially formulated a catfish plan for this purpose. Depu asked, "Do you need me to do anything, Captain?" Rebel nodded, "Yes, you are very important, and you may be kidnapped once." Note: One Lightning is a character in the movie Zootopia, a slow-moving sloth civil servant. Chapter 672 Workers' Arms. A band of bandits appeared near Tarnovsk Mountain Point. It is said to be composed of some Carpathians and Bulgarian mercenaries who were exiled to Austria, and has caused several cases in the town of Chebnya and other places. The news was published by Małopolska Izvestia. As for whether these things are true, people usually would rather believe it than believe it. As a result, half of the residents of Krakow were so nervous that they stayed behind closed doors before it got dark. Woman Mining Company did not take it seriously at first, until 3 French technicians of the company were robbed and killed on their way back to their dormitories. The company manager Ian Lovick hurriedly led people to the site of the incident, but only saw a few large pools of blood in the 3 technicians' empty wallets with their names embroidered on them. Search TWKAN on Google if this situation is very serious. You must know that there are only 15 French technicians in the silver mine. Without any one of them, the steam engine in the mine may become unusable due to malfunction. Of course, only Captain Ribble knew that these 3 people were secretly sent back to France by his men, and that what was on the ground was just chicken blood. After that, the gangs became more and more arrogant, carrying out open robberies almost every day. They even attacked a warehouse of the Woman Mining Company, stole the property inside, and then burned it down. At the company's high-level meeting, Shin Lovick shouted with a dark face to the tall man standing in front of him, "Mr. Makorski, those gangsters burned down Asuha's warehouse and walked away." In the warehouse the guards didn't even offer any resistance. Makorski lowered his head and said with great grievance, "Mr. General Manager, 60 or 70 gangsters came that day, and all of them were armed with flintlock rifles. At that time, there were only 11 guards in the warehouse. If they did not withdraw, if we leave, it will be burned to ashes together with the warehouse. Your patrol has more than 300 people, but you still can't deal with those gangsters. A place like the silver mine naturally has its own paramilitary protection, and Makorski is the captain of the silver mine patrol." "Yes, sir. There are hundreds of policemen on Tarnovsk Mountain. The Krakow garrison is not far away as well," Makorski defended, "but the mine is 40 miles wide, plus the nearby there are too many places to defend in several towns. I heard that there are more than 150 gangsters in that group, and the patrol team's current strength alone cannot prevent them at all." Next to him, a half-white-haired company director said, "Mr. Captain, how many people do you think the patrol team needs to expand to be able to effectively resist the gangs?" Makorski pondered for a moment and said, "At least 1,000 people, Baron Kishkov, and everyone must be equipped with a flintlock. Although the gang only has 150 people, their whereabouts are erratic. The patrol team must divide its forces to guard all key locations in the mine in order to barely ensure the safety of the mine." Depu spoke at the right time. "It will cost at least 800,000 zlotys to set up a standing patrol team of 1,000 people." "Sure enough." All the board members shook their heads when they heard such a large amount. In the end, the board of directors only gave Makorski the authority to add 150 patrol members and asked the garrison in Krakow to come to help suppress the bandits. However, just 5 days later, something more serious happened. Mr. Depu, the second manager of the company, who came to enforce the rights of the company's shareholders on behalf of France, and his assistant, coachman, and maid were all kidnapped by the gang. The kidnappers demanded a ransom of 400,000 zlotys, otherwise they would break the deal. The entire Woman Mining Company suddenly panicked. When a French technician was killed before the French ambassador sent someone to lodge a protest. Now, something happened to a senior manager, which may even cause a diplomatic dispute. The company's board of directors took only half an afternoon to make a decision to withdraw money from the company's account and redeem Mr. Depew. 400,000 zlotys is more than 600,000 francs, fortunately. It is in a silver mine. Otherwise, given Poland's difficult financial situation, other places may not be able to get it. The gangsters actually kept their word. After receiving the ransom, they immediately released Depew, his assistant, and the coachman, but they left the poor May behind. Senior executives of the mining company, as well as officials from Krakow, came to Depew's home to express their condolences. The villa was packed with people. However, Depew did not feel happy about surviving the disaster. Instead, he looked at Shulevich and other company executives with a gloomy face and said viciously, "If you were willing to spend that money to expand the patrol team, then I wouldn't do it either. Will fall into the hands of those devils. You must rescue her, otherwise I will definitely accuse Mr. Minister." Zion Lovick said cautiously, "Mr. Depew, you are just a servant. You don't have to. She's more than just a servant." Depew yelled, "I want her alive." Everyone in the room suddenly realized that the relationship between this maid and him was probably unusual. Under intense pressure from the kidnapping, Yumi Iron Mining Company finally agreed to expand the patrol to 650 people. But a full week passed, and there was still no news from Miss Denise. Instead, the gang committed another robbery in Szczebnica town. Depew was furious. He went directly to the Krakow municipal commissioner and asked him to recruit mercenaries to launch an encirclement and suppression campaign against the gangs. As for the cost, he can pay more than half. Well, actually, it was paid from the previous 400,000 zlotys ransom. The Krakow City Hall was also very troubled by the gang. After all, it was their jurisdiction. If they continued to make trouble like this, they would definitely not be able to vote in the next election. It happened that someone was willing to pay at this time, so they readily agreed. In the end, the Krakow City Hall also took out 150,000 zlotys, plus Depew's money, a total of 450,000. To recruit mercenaries, on the other hand, Depew's request for all silver miners to undergo military training was also successfully passed by the board of directors. Of course, the main reason was that Depew said that he could get 2,000 cheap flintlock rifles from France, and he would bear half of the cost. All the company executives saw that he was crazy. Who dared to raise any objections? The company quickly organized all the miners, including residents of several surrounding towns. Their livelihoods were mostly related to the mines, so they cooperated with the requirements of the mining company. A total of more than 4,000 young and middle-aged people who would undergo military training once a week for 6 hours each time. This amount of training may not seem like much, but in fact, except for the big countries like Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria, the European armies only train 3 to 5 days a month. And after these miners and townspeople have completed basic training, they can also be sent to fight bandits in actual combat. They certainly won't see the bandits, because they are all pretending to be people from the intelligence agency, but at least they can practice formations in the wild environment and get familiar with the officer's orders. Chapter 673, Burning Eastern Europe 1. A city in northeastern Poland. Vilnius. On the high platform in the city center square, Archbishop Malou, dressed in a black robe, held up the holy image of the cross and said passionately to the thousands of people gathered around him, "We will follow the guidance of God, use our souls and firm faith as weapons, and purify all heretics who dare to set foot here." The respected and great Pope received the oracle of God and ordered me to tell everyone about this revelation. People here, whether men, women, young or old, can become holy crusaders from now on, as long as they want. Whether he holds a sword, a musket or a hoe in his hand, he will be bathed in the holy light of God and embark on a holy war to the east. A huge shout like a tsunami suddenly broke out in the square. Holy war! Holy war! Drive away the heretics! Everyone's eyes were filled with enthusiasm and piety, listening to Archbishop Malou convey the Pope's teachings, and the flame of holy war burned in their hearts. Archbishop Felix Turski and several high-ranking Polish priests also stood behind the Pope's envoy Archbishop Malou, keeping their hands crossed in front of their chests in prayer before this They had accompanied the Pope's envoy to travel across most of Poland to call on people to join the new crusade to resist the Orthodox Christians under the inspiration of Archbishop Malou. The Poles donated enthusiastically to the army. Almost every town in the civilian world spontaneously formed the so-called Crusader Corps. The Warsaw Royal Ordnance Factory continuously transported brand new flintlock rifles to various places and handed them over to these civilian armed forces. Yes, since 5 months ago, this ordnance factory built with French aid has been able to produce imitation Tiller M1753 flintlock rifles at a rate of 2,300 per month. The reason why the Charleville flintlock was not produced was not only to sever the relationship with the French arsenal, but also because it was to arm the Polish army with captured Russian guns after the war, without worrying about the ammunition supply problem caused by different models. Of course, Archbishop Malou was Mesmer in disguise. He had a month of training in France and arrived in Poland with a full set of forged certificates. After that, he was assisted by the high-ranking priest Sias, and he did not make any mistakes. Well, Sias has never been very religious, so he has no objection to this. While Mesmer was inciting holy war everywhere, two carriages were galloping south of Krakow Point. Just as the two carriages arrived near the border between Poland and Austria, nearly 20 riders suddenly emerged from the jungle beside the road and surrounded them, some of whom were holding guns. "What are you going to do?" The window of the car in front opened, and a priest asked loudly. Among the riders, there was a middle-aged man in a black cloak, not tall, with fierce eyes. He ignored him, but got off the horse, went straight to the car behind, knocked on the door, and said, "Respected Archbishop Krasinski, where are you going?" The door opened, and it was Archbishop Kamieniec Krasinski, sitting inside. "If you want to rob, you can take anything here at will." The man in the black cloak took out a certificate. "I'm Lieutenant Kalishnikov of the Freedom and Security Committee. Let me be frank, your destination this time is Rome, right?" Archbishop Krasinski took a deep breath and said, "I have always believed that the members of the Bar Union are the most loyal servants of God. The Freedom and Security Committee was established on the basis of the Bar Union, so he was ready to give it a try." Lieutenant Kalishnikov nodded. "Yes, we are all the most devout believers." "Then you shouldn't stop me," Archbishop Krasinski said. "You are from the intelligence agency. You should be able to see that there is something wrong with the envoy." Kalishnikov looked down at the tip of his boots and said, "My mission is to send you back to Kamieniec. I don't care about other things." Archbishop Krasinski raised his voice. "That blasphemer, his Italian accent is weird, and he is obviously not familiar with the details of St. Peter's Basilica, but he dares to pretend to be the Pope's envoy. I must go to the Pope to verify and reveal his true face." Kalishnikov said word by word, "You can't leave Poland. Why? Did the liar give you a benefit, or do you also want to blaspheme God?" Lieutenant Kalishnikov sighed and made a cross on his chest. "God will forgive me for waiting. It's not only the Pope's envoys who can spread God's revelation." "Are you crazy? How is this possible?" "Because God will not abandon Poland, and the oracles about the crusade and the holy war will make Poland more united and more brave and fearless." Lieutenant Kalishnikov raised his eyes and said in a deep voice, "I have escaped from the guns of the Russians. I know how powerful Russia is. Now only the glory of God can bring us together to resist the upcoming Russian army." "You are crazy. You are all crazy. This is blasphemy." "I am crazy in accordance with God's will." Kalishnikov interrupted him, "And you will be confined to Kamieniec, or I will kill you here." He signaled to his men, "Drive the carriage back." Yes, in fact, half a month after Mesmer arrived in Poland, the Freedom and Security Committee noticed something was wrong with him. How could the group of fanatical believers in the Bal Alliance not see the authenticity of the papal envoy? But they later discovered that the nationalist enthusiasm of the Polish people, which had been rising before, was stimulated by religious inspiration and burst out with unprecedented power. Commoners and nobles put aside their differences and joined the same army. Lithuanians and Poles stopped fighting over local taxes and built fortifications together. Businessmen generously donated various supplies. The country is rapidly shedding its former aura of corruption and malaise. As a result, the Freedom and Security Council also joined in promoting jihad. All border roads to the Holy See were blocked by them. Anyone in Poland who questioned the papal envoy received warnings, and some stubborn priests were even secretly executed. The whole of Poland is on fire. October 15. 1792. Eastern Voivodeship of Poland. Mozyr in front of the defense line of the Polish Dnieper front. General Kosciuszko looked at the infantry company passing by in front of him and couldn't help but frown slightly. In the group of soldiers just now, he saw at least 5 people walking smoothly, and more than 10 people with their flintlock slings twisted into a ball. He sighed, turned his head, and said to the officer beside him, General Dąbrowski, these young people, perhaps 1/3 will not survive until the end of the first wave of Russian attacks. Chapter 674. Burning Eastern Europe 2. Brigadier General Dąbrowski said in very poor Polish, all sacrifices are worth it, and we will eventually get rid of Russian control and threat, and their bodies may fall, but their blood will condense into the soul of Poland, and the motherland will always be with them. He had attended military school in Saxony since he was a teenager, when Saxony and Poland were still one country, and did not return to Poland until 4 years ago, leaving him far more proficient in German than in Polish. Historically, it was for this reason that Prince Poniatowski never trusted him. However, Joseph knew very well that Dąbrowski was a staunch patriot. He later participated in the anti-Russian uprising led by Kosciuszko and performed extremely bravely in the defense of Warsaw. Therefore, at Joseph's suggestion, Dąbrowski was reused in the Polish army and served as the cavalry commander of the Dnieper front. Dąbrowski pointed to the narrow parapet between 2 hills in the distance. If one day I need to stand there and fight, I will also use my life to stop the invasion of Tsarist Russia. Kosciuszko nodded silently. Of the 50,000 Polish troops on the Mozy line of defense, 37,000 were new recruits with less than 4 months of training. They will face the most ferocious offensive of the Russian army. Yes, in order to complete the established combat deployment, this most important line of defense in the east can only be supported by new troops. Perhaps we will all die in this war. Kosciuszko seemed to feel that the topic was unlucky, so he raised his head and looked eastward. When do you think the Russians will attack? The reason why he asked this was because Russia had sent a formal note to Poland 5 days ago, which was actually an ultimatum, requiring the Polish government to immediately stop persecuting the nobility and Polish Orthodox Christians and to remove those who participated in the Targowica murder. The culprits were taken to Russia for trial, and abolish the provisions in the Polish constitution that restrict the privileges of the nobility. Civilians can freely purchase land, and civilians can serve as officers. The cause of the incident was that after the traitorous meeting in Targowica was destroyed, several members of the Potocki family fled to Russia. They complained to the Tsar that the Polish parliament had arrested and assassinated domestic nobles without reason, and requested Russia to send troops to stabilize the situation in Poland. This is exactly the same as the traitorous behavior of the Targowica alliance in history. However, at present, after continuous attacks by Polish intelligence organizations, these reactionary nobles have failed to mobilize the army, and their influence has been greatly weakened. In fact, Potocki arrived in Petersburg as early as the beginning of the year, but at that time Catherine II was unable to actively prepare for war due to Stanislaw II's emotional offensive, so she could only suppress this in advance. According to the plan left by Potemkin before his death, Russia should fully invade Poland in the spring of next year. However, when Catherine II learned through the intelligence system that preparations for war in Poland were in full swing, she immediately realized that her plan to invade Poland could no longer be concealed. After discussing with the Russian generals, she believed that it would be more advantageous to take action in advance, while Poland was not fully prepared. As a result, Count Potocki was taken out by the Russians as an excuse to start a war. Who knows? Dąbrowski shook his head. Maybe next month, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next moment. Before he finished speaking, he saw a war horse galloping towards him. Before the horse came to a complete stop, the officer riding on it jumped down in a hurry and said to Kosciuszko, "General, the Russians declared war just this morning." Kosciuszko and Dombrowski frowned and looked at each other. Before they could say anything, they heard the roar of artillery in the distance. Kosciuszko put his hand on the hilt of his sword and said to the herald beside him, "Let the soldiers enter the zone. Tell them not to be nervous. The Russians are still far away. The battlefield range of this large-scale national war will be very large. Poland has deployed many outposts along the border. The shelling just now should be the Russian army clearing these peripheral defense points, and Poland's main defense line is still 7 or 8 kilometers away behind that point." Kosciuszko continued to issue orders in an orderly manner. "Have the Rangers keep me informed of Russian movements, and pay special attention to the right wing. The terrain there is very suitable for Cossack cavalry sneak attacks, using Cossack cavalry to maneuver quickly and then launch a surprise attack at the opponent's weak point is a common tactic used by Russian commanders. Anyone who despises them will suffer a great loss." "Yes, General." After the herald left, Dombrowski said with some worry, "I'd better go to the right wing and keep an eye on it myself." "No, just leave it to Mochilok." Kosciuszko stopped him. "Your battlefield is not here." The sudden attack by the Russian army caused a certain panic in Moz's Polish army, but fortunately Poland had made a lot of preparations for the war, so the chaos did not last long, and a large number of troops quickly followed the arrangements made in advance. A defense line was launched along the border southeast of Mozy's Zagorzyk village point. This small village is located near the Polish border. Because of the war, the villagers have already abandoned their homes and fled. At this time, the village has become part of the defense line. Bang! A shell hit hard next to a dilapidated farmhouse, causing the ground to tremble. Point behind the rotten window, Corporal Drasovitz glanced at the 6 or 7 young people sitting or standing huddled next to him, and sighed in his heart. Although the squad leader did not say it explicitly, as the only veteran who had fought in Slavonia, he was responsible for managing these new recruits. He used to be just a bricklayer, and did not like to speak in public. But at this time he could only try to imitate the posture of the town officials and said loudly, "Oh, don't worry, although the sound of the cannon is scary, the shells will not hit us directly." He thought for a moment and pointed to a small flying insect on the wall that had not yet frozen to death. "It's as difficult as hitting that guy with a stone at 50 steps away." The sound of artillery in the distance was still dense, but everyone looked up and relaxed a lot when they saw Drasovitz's relaxed look. The corporal nodded with satisfaction, but the next moment, there was another loud noise next to him, and then the house shook, and grass and wood debris flew everywhere. When the dust settled, everyone saw that a corner of the farmhouse, along with the pig pen next to it, was torn apart by a shell and turned into bricks and stones all over the floor. Drasovitz quickly confirmed that no one was injured, and then spread his hands awkwardly. "You see, I told you that, even if it was very close, it would not hit us directly." He looked at the crumbling frame of the house again and frowned. "But we have to leave here." When the recruits left the farmhouse, Drasovitz saw that the blond young man walking at the back had obviously trembling legs, so he stepped forward and patted him. "Yannick, be strong. There is nothing to be afraid of in war." The young man turned his head, grinning, and there seemed to be light in his eyes. "Mr. Drasovitz, I'm not afraid. I'm so excited now." Chapter 675 Burning Eastern Europe 3. "You should be afraid of war." The burly curly-haired man in front of Yannick turned his head sideways. "Russians are not weak." "What's that?" The blond young man puffed up his chest. "I'm a glorious crusader, and I will destroy all heretics and invaders under the light of God." The burly man shook his head and said disdainfully, "God will not help you block cannonballs." Drasovitz immediately interrupted him loudly. "Krzysztof, you will affect morale." He turned to Yannick and whispered, "He was a Livonian, you know, his family was dead." Livonia was originally a province in northeastern Poland and was occupied by Russia during the One Melon War. After that, the Catholics there were repeatedly persecuted. Krzysztof's family was executed for supporting the anti-Russian resistance, and he was only able to escape execution as a child. Drasovitz pointed to a nearby farmhouse with rubble and wood piled at the door, indicating that no soldiers lived there, and said, "Let's go there." The Most indispensable thing here is empty houses, and as long as they don't leave too far from the east parapet, they can choose temporary barracks at Wall Point. When Drasovitz pulled away the garbage outside the door and pushed open the door, he immediately smelled a stench and then saw a teenage boy, covered in filth, huddled in the corner of the room, looking timidly. "Hold yourself." Yanek followed in, glanced at the child, frowned and said, "Why are you still in the village? The Russians are coming." When the child heard Polish, he immediately said cautiously, "Old master, do you have anything to eat?" The voice turned out to be a girl. Krzysztof squeezed over, took out a piece of black bread from his backpack, and handed it to her. "Eat." The child grabbed the bread, took a bite, then turned around and shouted, "Kaki, there is food, come out quickly." After a moment, a little boy about 6 or 7 years old, who was dirtier than her, came out of the fireplace, took half of the bread, and started to gnaw on it. Drasovitz looked at the two children. "Didn't you leave with the adults?" The girl chewed the bread hard and said calmly, "Auntie didn't take us away." It took a while for Drasovitz to understand that the father of the two children had died of illness last month, and their relatives had left them here. The corporal hesitated for a moment, took out his food, and signaled to Yannick, "Give me yours too." He gave the girl a few large pieces of brown bread and a bit of bacon, and pointed to the west, "Take your brother, and walk straight this way. You will see the supply station in 2 or 3 days. The baggage train there may be able to take you to Slutsk." Looking at the food in her hand, that was enough for her and her brother to last for 4 or 5 days. The girl knelt down to thank the soldiers, and then amidst the rumble of cannons, she picked up the little boy and ran out of the village. Yannick watched them go away and made the sign of the cross on his chest. "May God bless them." As soon as he finished speaking, he heard the chirping sound of artillery shells piercing the air past his ears. Immediately, a black iron ball hit the ground hard, raising mud all over the sky. Under the influence of huge inertia, the cannonball bounced off the ground, fell, bounced up again, and then passed gently over the backs of the siblings. "No!" Drasowitz roared angrily, dropped his gun, and ran over like crazy. On that piece of hay, there was only blood spattered far away, and fragments of the girl's dirty clothes. There is no trace of the person. The corporal felt a tightness in his chest, lowered his head, and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Ah! Ah!" Several other soldiers also gathered around, staring blankly at the ground without saying a word. Suddenly, Krzysztof raised his gun with red eyes, pointed in the direction of the cannonball, and pulled the trigger hard. The sound of pop gunshots was heard. Breathing heavily, he took out the gunpowder bag and poured it into the barrel of the gun tremblingly. A sergeant heard the gunshot and ran out from a hut not far away, pointing at Krzysztof and shouting, "Henrik, what are you doing? Don't shoot without orders, these bastards." Krzysztof gritted his teeth and made a dull sound in his throat. Drasovitz hurriedly took away his gun and said to the sergeant, "Monitor, please forgive him. 2 children were killed just now, so." He suddenly paused, quickly ran to the haystack beside the squad leader, pulled hard a few times, and took little Kaki out of it. "He's alive," he shouted over his shoulder. Half an hour later, the little boy woke up slowly in the smelly farmhouse and looked around blankly. Those kind-hearted soldiers were all here, but his sister was missing. The Russian bombardment continued throughout the day. Drasovitz no longer said that the shells will not hit us, because the density of the Russian army's artillery far exceeded any battle he had seen before. Half of the houses in the village were destroyed by artillery shells. The soldiers no longer dared to stay in the houses, but gathered in groups under the parapet. At 10 AM the next day, trumpets sounded almost simultaneously along the Polish defense line, which was more than 10 kilometers long. Without needing to be reminded by the company commander, Drasovitz loudly greeted the recruits, "Get up, hurry up. The Russians are coming. Prepare to form a formation." He had just joined the horizontal team behind the breastwork with a few new recruits, when he vaguely saw a large number of Russian soldiers in grey uniforms emerging from the bushes in the distance. The grey color became more and more visible in their field of vision. More than 10 minutes later, the grey crowd had covered the open space in front of the breastwork, like a dark cloud with no end in sight, slowly surging towards the Polish defense line. Soon, Dratsevitz and others could vaguely hear the drums from the Russian side. Krzysztof swallowed his saliva and said hoarsely, "Damn, how many people are there?" Dratsevitz glanced at the company commander and whispered, "Don't be nervous. There are less than 800 people. They should just be the scattered soldiers they used to test." The company commander rode past them on horseback and shouted loudly, "Keep calm, don't move." Soon, the dark cloud had pressed more than 100 steps away. The only two cannons in Zagazig village were pushed out of the haystack and began to fire at the Russians. The shells left a few bright red spots in the Russian army, but they did not slow down their pace at all. When the nearest Russian soldier approached 60 steps in front of the breastwork, they stopped and started shooting. "Ready." The company commander's voice finally came, and Rasovitz immediately raised his gun and signaled to the recruits beside him, "Did you hear that? Hold up your guns, but don't shoot." Yannick excitedly aimed at the tallest Russian in his field of vision and heard the officer's order, "Aim, shoot." As soon as his finger touched the trigger, he heard a muffled puff sound, and when he looked sideways, he saw that the teammate standing on the left had lost half of his head, and a pungent smell of blood immediately enveloped him. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.